a lot of logic that we bake into that is that we're going into an era of a very different in the sense of enhanced productivity growth, something we haven't seen in the last cycle, but we did see in the 90s. And so we see the opportunity here in a resilient economy with stocks cheap, that it's most likely a new business cycle, a new bull market, and of course, as I mentioned, AI tech-led. And so I think, the Fed will probably cut. I'm not sure they need to cut as much as people think they do. And I think that's because earnings are going to probably be better than expected this quarter and for the rest of the year. So I think people should maybe just stop so much with the Fed talk, which has been really obviously consuming us all for the last 2 years. I think it's going to be more about earnings and prices of stocks.
Very refreshing to hear you say that as somebody whose my job it is to hang on to every word the Fed says. So covering the economy and the Fed. So I appreciate your perspective there for us, James. But this is really interesting, this AI-led super cycle. I mean, take us through that and how people are really going to get behind the idea that AI seems to be what you're saying here will be the primary market driver rather than the Fed. That's a kind of revolutionary idea.
Well, it seems revolutionary because the last 2 years, that's all we hear about. But if you think about the longer term, and I've been doing this for 35 years, the Fed is usually not the focus of the conversation all the time. It really is more about corporate profits or what's the health of the economy. And that's why we think we're going to sort of move towards that. The AI sort of super cycle that we envision, you just think about how companies, and it's not just tech companies getting more productive with tech and AI, I think it's really going to go across all sectors. I mean, at the JP Morgan healthcare conference last week, I am in San Francisco right now, even though I'm based in Manhattan. But last week, the buzzword across the healthcare companies was AI. And I think investors should recognize AI is going to be crossing lots of different sectors, and it's going to make these companies much more productive. And we think that earnings over the next 5 to 7 years possibly triple. And that's what leads us to these large index focus points we have, like where the Dow will be 7 to 10 years from now. We think it's a triple, 100,000 Dow.
Okay, we're going to hold you to that.
Hard to believe. Well, yeah, I'll be back in 10 years.
Having lived through the dot-com bubble, there was a lot of flotsam and jetsam, but eventually, it was revolutionary, the internet for all of us. When does AI really start to gel in terms of productivity and in terms of sales for the companies that are doing AI? I guess, NVIDIA, one of the obvious choices there.
Yeah, and I would like to say that today is a microcosm of what I view over the next 3 to 5 years. You see this big NASDAQ move on Taiwan Semi's numbers. And, how long does it take for AI to really show up in the earnings and the profitability and productivity? It's a very good question. Now, some places it's already showing up, and we've seen that in the earnings reports of the early adapters in technology. I'm talking about technology companies using the NVIDIA chips, like a Microsoft or a Google. You're already seeing that, affecting their bottom line. But, I think for it to be seen across a lot of the other sectors that we envision it affecting, investors are going to need to be patient. But, one thing about the stock market that you both know, it's a discount mechanism. So, the stock market's not going to wait for the earnings to get accretive because of AI. It's going to discount that before it happens. So I think investors should be really careful here about being too bearish, too Fed-centric, and just be like, okay, wait a minute. If this is real, if this is going to lead to productivity growth, higher margins and corporate profits, you want to kind of buy dips here. And even those dips might be shallow, as this recent one has been. So I think we should be really careful about being too bearish.
You gave the Dow forecast. What about the NASDAQ 100?
Well, I think that's really where you, as an investor, you can't ignore the Magnificent Seven in the NASDAQ 100. It's very important. I know people think, oh gosh, it's a nosebleed.
Just got like 10 seconds left there.
Bleed leaves. But these stocks are cheap relative to their growth. NVIDIA's gotten lower PE as the earnings have gone up this year.
All right. I'm going to say that's the San Francisco view.
The San Francisco loft view, that is.
James Demmer, Chief Investment Officer at Main Street Research, joining us from San Francisco. And NASDAQ 100, since I mentioned it, 208 points higher. That is up 1.3% in today's trading. You are listening to Watching Bloomberg Markets. I'm John Tucker, along with Molly Smith. And it brings us to 11:50. God bless you. Company news now. And for that, here's Steve Rappaport.
John Bayer may be staying together as one big company in spite of investor pressure. The details on that from Bloomberg's Denise Pellegrini.
We're hearing Bayer is finding breaking up is hard to do. Sources telling us Chief Executive Officer Bill Anderson and other Bayer leaders are leaning against breaking up the conglomerate. It's been looking at ways to separate its consumer health or crop science division after Bayer's painful Monsanto acquisition. Amid all those rising claims by tens of thousands of customers that Roundup is carcinogenic. Bayer has a strategy meeting scheduled for March 5th. Word is management may say it wants to focus on its new operational model announced yesterday instead and push any possible structural changes to a later date. Denise Pellegrini, Bloomberg Radio.
Humana slashed its 2023 earnings outlook as the cost of members' care exceeded expectations. More on that from Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta.
Let me drive you through those numbers here. The full year adjusted EPS coming in about $26.09. They saw initially the expectation was $28.25. So you're seeing a miss by over $2 there on a full year adjusted EPS. That's a pretty big margin. They're also, however, talking about that 2023 earnings outlook, and they're attributing it to those higher costs of care.
That's Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta reporting. Right now, shares of Humana are down more than 12%. Tech layoffs continue. Google has let go over 1,000 employees across various departments since January 10th, and now The Verge is reporting more may be coming. It reports Google's chief has told employees to brace for additional cuts. And those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Steve Rappaport. This is Bloomberg. Stay tuned for more Bloomberg Markets coming up right after this.
You're listening to Bloomberg Markets on Bloomberg Radio.
And you're listening and watching the Bloomberg Markets. I'm John Tucker along with Molly Smith. That brings us to 11:55 on Wall Street. Let's get an update on news from around the world. And in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, that's where we find Amy Morris. Hi, Amy.
Hi, John. More than a dozen Acela trains have been canceled because of winter storms and extreme cold weather. Those high-speed Acela trains between Washington, D.C. and Boston are completely canceled today. And then service alongside the Empire Builder line is canceled for today and tomorrow. The winter weather also forcing lawmakers to wrap up their work today because they are not going to hold any votes tomorrow. One of those votes is the stopgap bill that the Senate is, I'm looking at it now, voting on right now. The House could also get it and clear it as soon as today. The deadline for this is tomorrow night. Congressional leaders say they're cautiously optimistic after meeting with President Biden about unlocking a deal on Ukraine aid and border security. Bloomberg government's Jack Fitzpatrick tells us there's a big X factor in those talks.
Donald Trump posted on Truth Social, I do not think we should do a border deal at all unless we get everything needed. Presumably because a lot of conservatives want to campaign on that and are waiting for Trump to win the presidential election if he's going to.
Bloomberg Government Congress reporter Jack Fitzpatrick in Washington. The Justice Department releasing its report on the law enforcement response to a school shooting that rocked the tiny Texas town of Uvalde. 19 students and 2 teachers were killed in that shooting. State Senator Roland Gutierrez, who represents the area, says the report is clearing up confusion about what really happened that day.
We had a very early on Texas House of Representatives report that we now know had a lot of inaccuracies, things about doors not working. The doors just work just fine.
State Senator Gutierrez says the report is highly critical of Department of Public Safety employees, state officials. 5 officers were fired, including the school's police chief. House Republicans also plan to advance an impeachment resolution against Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas on January 31st. That's according to a document obtained by Bloomberg Government. The date was set before the first formal hearing against Mayorkas last week. Global news 24 hours a day whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. John and Molly.
All right, Amy, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. It's 11:57 on Wall Street. All right, I've put it off long enough. I've resisted long enough.
You know
but
you want
Molly
to.
has worn me down. What time is it in Australia, by the way?
It is 3:57 a.m. in Melbourne right now.
And they're still playing tennis?
They just finished about 10 minutes ago. This was the last match of the day. The 3 seed on the men's side, Daniil Medvedev, if you want to try to say that.
Medvedev.
There you go. That was smooth. He just pulled out a 5-set victory, 6-love in the 5th set over Emil Rusevori. Want to try that one?
Yusufori, right?
Close enough.
I'm
Anyways.
still working on Jokovic or Djokovic.
Yeah, it's like more like the J is kind of silent.
Okay.
Or
so
it's
we're
DJ,
talking
yeah,
we're
it
talking
works.
upsets both men's and women's, so it's been exciting.
It's been well. So this one, I mean, I guess wasn't an upset on paper, but he was pushed, and a lot of the men's seeds overnight were Alcaraz. He came through in a tight 4-setter. We also saw Alexander Zverev, the 6th seed. He was pushed, as well as Casper Ruud, the 11th seed. Both of those guys winning in 5th set tiebreaks. The women's side, though, some big upsets overnight. The 3 seed, Elena Rybakina, previous Wimbledon champion, lost in a 3rd set tiebreak, 22-20. I think that is a 42-point tiebreak. I think that's the longest one in Grand Slam history, or at least at the Australian Open. And the 5 seed, Jess Pegula, her family owns the Buffalo Bills, for us friends back at home. She also went out in straight sets. So some draws are opening up. And my bracket is falling apart.
All right, who are your picks? I mean, who are your favorites?
I mean, I gotta say, Iga Swiatek and Coco Gauff still looking pretty good. Iga being the top seed, the world #1 on the women's side. She still looks great. And Djokovic and Alcaraz on the men's side, and Jannik Sinner as well. So those picks still intact for me.
I think you've missed your calling. You should be, doing tennis matches.
Well, you could hold the fort for the next hour.
Yeah,
Maybe I'll get going.
Yeah, I don't think so.
All right.
Molly Smith, John Tucker, Bloomberg Markets, your Australian update right here on Bloomberg Radio. We'll get back to the markets in just a moment. This is Bloomberg Radio.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
Why were the economists so wrong? What are the economists getting wrong? Isn't this a slam dunk time to buy U.S. Treasuries?
Soft landing, hard landing, no landing. I don't know.
True. What the heck does that mean?
I don't know.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
We're going to be in an environment with higher rates for longer.
The 5-day in-office work week is effectively dead.
It's definitely a good sign that we're not ready to land this economy just yet.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
And I'm John Tucker. And we are in for Matt and Paul, Molly Smith alongside me. More signs of resilience in the U.S. labor market. Applications for unemployment benefits unexpectedly dropping last week to the lowest level in more than a year. Construction of new homes in the U.S. falling for the first time in 4 months, and technology companies climbing in early trading. Also, some breaking news crossing the Bloomberg. Molly Smith, you want to tackle that one?
Oh, yeah. This is, kind of had to feel this one coming out of Spirit Airlines after the JetBlue deal did not go through the other day. Spirit now, this is coming from the Wall Street Journal, reporting that the airline is examining options to address its financial challenges after that deal was blocked with JetBlue. So Spirit now plans to discuss with advisors a path forward as it faces near-term debt maturities. This is all according to people familiar with the matter. Stock is tanking right now. It is down, below $5, and that's on top of, it's just been a really
that deal was pretty much kind of do or die for
that's
airline,
we were talking with a few of our guests about this yesterday, and that a lot of people were speculating if a Spirit might be headed for a bankruptcy filing, that this deal was really their last lifeline. So going to be interesting to see how this one unfolds.
Maybe we'll have to track down George Ferguson a little later. Let's right now get an update on the market. So market reset, and here's Charlie Pellet.
Hi, thank you very much, John Amata. Here's what's going on. The Dow lower, S&P, NASDAQ, they're both higher. Spirit, as you guys just broke the news here on Bloomberg Radio, stock tanking 24.5%. SAVE on the ticker on Spirit. We have got JetBlue shares advancing up another 2.3%. $4.79 right now on JetBlue. But again, the headline from the Bloomberg Professional Service, Spirit Airlines exploring restructuring options. This, according to the Journal. Right now, Spirit shares, again, down by just about 24.5%. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ trading mixed. We're looking at a 90-point drop right now in the Dow Jones Industrial Average, down 0.2%. We have got the S&P 500 index higher by 13, up by the 0.3% right now. NASDAQ up by 1%. Right now, the 10-year yield, 4.14%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.35%. Gold up 0.4%, 2013 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.1%, 74.10 a barrel. Bitcoin down today by 1.9%, 41,845 on Bitcoin. The World Economic Forum underway in Davos. Bloomberg Radio is there. This morning we caught up with Bank of America's CEO Brian Moynihan. You heard the conversation live here on Bloomberg Markets, and we asked him about the Federal Reserve and the outlook for interest rates.
Our core team has 4 cuts and 4 cuts, 24 and 25. And so if you sort that through, people wouldn't interpret that, but that is actually higher for longer because you came off of 25 basis points, and if you end up at 3.5 next year, 8 quarters away from now. So I think the team, Mike and the team, basically they're saying they're going to have to start cutting because they have the space to cut and the economy can keep growing. And the last thing you want to do is tip this thing over.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. Humana shares plummeted after preliminary earnings missed estimates on higher than expected costs of members' care, and the Medicare-focused insurer forecast anemic enrollment growth for the year. Shares of Humana are down by 12%. Again, recapping, stocks are trading mixed. The Dow lower, S&P up 12, gain there of 0.3%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thanks a lot. Let's take a look under the hood right now, some of the specific names and companies that are moving in today's markets. And our stocks reporter, Nora Melinda, joins us right now. We start again with a home builder with nothing to do with the data today that we got.
Nothing to do with the data today. Looking at MDC Holdings, it is seeing its biggest gain in almost 4 years and highest intraday level since May of 2021. That all comes after a Japanese home builder, Seiki So-e House, agreed to purchase the firm in an all-cash transaction valued at $4.9 billion. MDC shares are up as much as 19% in trading today. This transaction really marks the latest move from a Japanese home builder to expand in the U.S. market.
So it looks like with the way that MDC is trading right now, it's just about near $63 a share, and that's what MDC shareholders would receive in the event of this takeout. So those are trading pretty nicely today, up, you said, quite a bit on the day. Let's talk about some of those tech stocks. What's going on there?
Yes, tech is the biggest gainer, the best performing sector in the S&P 500 today, after Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, that's TSMC, reported fourth quarter results that beat expectations and forecast a rebound in demand. This is huge news because the world's most valuable chip maker is giving some positive news after a years-long slump for the industry in terms of tech demand.
All right, what else you got for us?
Also, looking over here at Discover, back into that financial space, which we've really been talking about over the past couple of days, Discover shares are down as much as 10%. That's a pretty big plunge for its biggest drop since August. It's the second biggest decliner by percentage in the S&P 500 right now as well, after posting a 62% drop in fourth quarter profit. This comes as the company has continued to grapple with the fallout from compliance and risk management lapses that led to the resignation of its CEO last year.
All right, Nora, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Molly, why don't you do the breaking news that we did at the top of the hour with
on the Australian Open?
Not the Australian Open.
On Spirit Airlines, of course, coming back into our actual job for the day. Right, so after the JetBlue and Spirit deal fell apart, Spirit Airlines now, the Wall Street Journal is reporting, is examining options to address its financial challenges. They might be looking into some kind of a restructuring as it faces near-term jet maturities, has about $1.1 billion in debt due by next September. And the risks surrounding its ability to refinance that debt are increasing. That's according to a Fitch ratings report that came out yesterday. So helping us to break this all down, we've now got George Ferguson with us. He's our Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Aerospace and Airlines Analyst. George, you're with us on the phone here today. Seems like this was something we kind of maybe saw coming following the collapse of the JetBlue deal. Tell us if this was something on your radar.
Absolutely. So thanks for having me on. Absolutely. Spirit is definitely in a rough position right here. And so I think the idea that they're exploring restructuring options, probably a lot of different options, does not surprise us at all. The profitability hasn't been good. I'm sure management's lost its focus as it's gone through this, potential acquisition by JetBlue. And now the difficulty will be, getting the ship righted, getting employees, management focused on getting this airline back to profitability, and hanging over it are these $1.1 billion in bonds that are due 2025. They probably need to be managed to some degree. The refinancing has to be done by the end of this year. Otherwise, I think their accountants will put a going concern statement on their financials, and it's not a place you want to be.
So what's the next step to avoid becoming toast?
So, look, I still think there's a bunch of value inside Spirit. The markets have punished them in the last couple of days. We know that markets can go too far one direction or another. I think what's interesting here, I think there's a bunch of things interesting. One is these bonds, these $1.1 billion of bonds, they're backed by their loyalty program. I would argue their loyalty program isn't as important to a company like Spirit Airlines, or airline like Spirit Airlines, as it is to a Delta Airlines or someone like that. There's a lot more revenue flowing through the Delta income statement than through the Spirit income statement from that. And so, there may even be this permutation where someone like Spirit, if they need to shed capacity, could go through a bankruptcy restructuring process. And those bonds may get little to nothing. Maybe they have to shed some airplanes, but maybe they could right-size the firm smaller after that, with just less of a fleet. That could be an option. A sale of this company to another airline. Look at Frontier. JetBlue got in the way of a Frontier purchase. Frontier much smaller. They'd be, the combined company could be a lot smaller size of the U.S. market. Maybe the administration, DOJ, wouldn't contest that as much because there'd be no sort of dominance. You'd be putting a carrier together with another carrier that was potentially, at risk of failing. Anyways, Frontier's backed by Indigo Partners, private equity firm that likes to restructure airlines, turn them around, sell them more expensively. This is certainly a cheap piece of real estate right now. There's things, there's options like that, I think, that are on the table for the airline.
Next thought has to go to where the Alaska-Hawaiian deal potentially would stand. And if that one as well doesn't come through, George, are either of those companies as desperate as Spirit, to really leaning on a deal here, or they'd be able to survive if it didn't go through?
I think Alaska is in a pretty similar, Hawaiian is in a pretty similar situation as Spirit, and that is there's a bunch of debt out there that they've got to refinance. And so to some degree, getting them together, kind of gets the nicer balance sheet of Alaska to get them through the next couple of years that look pretty difficult. So it's a bit of a similar situation. Alaska, I think, would be exploring options Hawaiian would be exploring options if the Alaska deal doesn't go through.
All right, George, thanks a lot for coming on short notice. George Ferguson, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Aerospace and Airlines Analyst. Again, the report from the Journal, Spirit Airlines Exploring Restructuring Options. And that brings us to 12:11 on Wall Street. Molly, I have a question.
Hit me.
How do you have a recession when you have a resilient jobs market in the U.S. economy?
Doesn't sound like a recession to me.
We actually have somebody who might be able to answer that. Let's get a broader view of the data that we got today and the economy. Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. I get winded with this title. Mike McKee. Yeah, so that's the question. I mean, the data we got today, they are weekly jobless claims, so more frequent data. I don't know how, what the trend is. Maybe that's the better question.
Well, you're starting to learn like you've learned a little something here, John. Starting to sound like it. You got to look at the trend.
It was bound to happen.
Took him long enough.
You got to look at the trend rather than the absolute number. I was just since we can't show this color chart I made on black and white radio, I did send Molly the chart. This time of year, we always see jobless claims go down. It's seasonal residuality, probably, from when they used to hire a lot of people at department stores for the holidays and then let them go. So I wouldn't take the 187,000 as any kind of a real number, but the fact that they're staying low and they're not rising on a regular basis tells you that the labor market is still fairly strong. The companies are not letting people go. They're holding on to their workers. And as you said, in the preamble, how do you have a recession in those cases? Well, Fed officials would say you don't. That's one of the reasons.
Maybe I could be a Fed official. Didn't I just say that?
Yeah, well,
just kidding.
Governor Smith.
Oh, I'm being risen to a governor already. Wow, thanks for the promotion, Mike. But I had a question for you yesterday that I was struggling to get my head around, that our Bloomberg economics colleagues had mentioned, that to note that you don't necessarily need to see a drop-off in consumption during a downturn. And I caught up with them after our conversation yesterday because I was really stumped on that. And they were saying that you might see the slowdown in the economy come more from business investment or from residential construction, and that would maybe then be how GDP falls off rather than people losing their jobs and not spending their money.
Well, one of the reasons that we're expecting to see growth be slower in the fourth quarter, not as slow as people had anticipated, still looks like it's going to be a good quarter, is inventories. Inventories drop off. Companies have been working down inventories, and that also brings down GDP without affecting consumption. So there's a lot of different ways that it can happen.
Are we somewhere near price stability and full employment?
Isn't
Can I
that
check
the
those
million-dollar
boxes?
question?
We are close to that. Of course, neither one of those has an absolute definition. The Fed thinks price stability is around 2%, but the old Greenspan line about price stability is when the change in prices does not affect business or consumer decisions. You're not going to put off buying something because you think it'll be cheaper tomorrow. You're not going to hold off on investing, that sort of thing. So 2% is the Fed's target, but we're reasonably close to that now. We should get in the PCE index this next week. We should see core join the headline in the 2% range. And if we get that, that tells you we're getting pretty close. Full employment is also one of those things we don't have an actual definition for, but Fed officials do believe that we are beyond full employment at this point, that it's somewhere in the 4% range. And right now we're 3.7%, so we're very well employed at this point.
Yeah, I mean,
All right,
even if
I'm
you...
satisfied.
Okay, John.
Let's
so
go
you-
gangbusters.
Let's cut rates. Is that what you're saying?
Or yeah, I mean, what's with this last couple of miles to get to 2% or wherever we're supposed to be? I mean, it's just like.
Well, that's the hard part. There are always things that are going up in price and always things that are going down in price. And squeezing the last little bit of that 1% out isn't necessarily easy. You also get into the different kinds of seasonal factors and base effects from the year before. So it takes a while for this to come through. The big thing to watch, I think, when we get next week's numbers and going forward is rents, because the housing market has been the part that's been going down more slowly than people thought.
What do we call it? The owner equivalent rents?
Owner's equivalent
super
rent
core?
yeah, owner's equivalent rent is the way they sort of impute the housing numbers into the CPI, not the PCE, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a new rent index that's experimental, but it shows the rent levels going down faster than any of the others. So it is possible we're mismeasuring a little bit. That's one reason that inflation is coming down in that last percent pretty slowly, is it's taking longer to get it out of housing.
We don't really get a great look at that in the same way, though, in the PCE, though, do we, as far as rents go?
We don't get the same kind of look at it. It's all a matter of how you want to define what housing costs are. But the biggest thing is housing costs are about a third of the weight of the CPI, and they're about half that in the PCE. So housing is not as important to the PCE numbers, which is one big reason that they are traditionally lower than CPI.
Mike, thanks. Appreciate it. Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent.
Try to fit
Michael
that on your
McKee.
business card.
No, it doesn't fit. I tried it. Again, the numbers that we got this morning, at least showing a resilient labor market. You wrote the story. What did you say?
This one I only edited, so but thank you, John. Yeah, this one was pretty impressive. I mean, the jobless claims number, those initial applications down below 200,000, and the continuing claims, people receiving benefits also lower.
All right, S&P 500 right now, 14 points higher. You are listening to Bloomberg Markets. And that brings us to 12:18 on Wall Street. Let's get company news now. And with the update, here's Steve Rappaport.
John, Apple smartwatches without a blood oxygen feature go on sale in the U.S. today following a setback in its patent dispute with Massimo. Bloomberg's Gina Cervetti reports.
Apple said the tweaked Series 9 and Ultra 2 models will be available at its retail outlets and online store. Apple itself can't sell watches with the blood oxygen feature, while an appeal of a ban on the sale of the watches in the U.S. plays out. The company believes that could take a year or more.
That's Gina Cervetti reporting. Shares of Apple currently up more than 2%. Yesterday, we told you about J.P. Morgan Chase planning to add to its headcount this year. So is Goldman Sachs. The firm is looking to make fresh hires in its asset and wealth management units as it continues to expand those businesses. That's according to its international CEO, Richard Node.
What is really, really important to us is that we have the best team on the field. We feel terrific about the team that we've got. The strategic focus of the firm is as good as it's ever been. We've got two significant pillars, both of scale. And at the end of the day, the success of that strategy depends on the quality of our people.
That's Goldman Sachs International CEO Richard Node speaking to Bloomberg TV from the World Economic Forum in Davos. Here's another take on dry January. What about giving up your phone for 30 days? USA Today reports yogurt maker Siggy's Dairy is offering $10,000 and other prizes to 10 people who participate in its 30-day digital detox program. The purpose, according to the company, to show people the benefits of going digital free. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Steve Rappaport, and this is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. A developing story that we are watching. Spirit Airlines shares, they are plunging right now, down 24%. Spirit lower following that Wall Street Journal report that the airline is exploring restructuring options following the JetBlue deal collapse. George Ferguson follows the airline industry for Bloomberg Intelligence. He was a guest moments ago right here on Bloomberg Markets.
Spirit is definitely in a rough position right here, and so I think the idea that they're exploring restructuring options, probably a lot of different options, does not surprise us at all. The profitability hasn't been good. I'm sure management's lost its focus as it's gone through this, potential acquisition by JetBlue, and now the difficulty will be, getting the ship righted, getting employees, management focused on getting this airline back to profitability.
And again, we've got Spirit down 24%. JetBlue shares, they are higher now by 2.3%. We're looking at a mixed market right now. A rally in some of the world's largest tech companies is fueling a rebound in stocks. Traders also weighing the latest economic data. And Fed speak, 4 clues about the central bank's next steps. So here's where we stand. S&P higher by 10, up by about 0.2%. The Dow lower by 84, dropped there of 0.2%. NASDAQ 100 index up 144, up 0.9%. NASDAQ Composite Index up 0.8%. 10-year yield 4.14%. Spot gold up 0.4% right now to $20.14 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is up 2.1%, $74.11 for a barrel of WTI. Apple shares are gaining after Bank of America upgraded the iPhone maker to buy from neutral, a sign of confidence in the stock following a weak start to the trading year. Again, recapping, stocks are mixed. S&P up 10 right now, higher by 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thanks very much. You are listening and watching to Bloomberg Markets. Molly Smith and John Tucker with you, in for Paul and Matt. Well, what are they getting done or not done in Washington, D.C.? Let's get the update from the nation's capital now. Nathan Dean of Bloomberg Intelligence join us. You know, I was kidding. I was not kidding before. They have like one snowplow in all of Washington, D.C.
Is that so,
and snow's on the way. And Nathan, I got to imagine that's actually a motivating factor today as they take on some really serious business like keeping the government open.
Yeah, you know, no joking aside, trying to get to your flight at Reagan or out at Dulles during a snowstorm certainly made the policymakers come to an agreement a date earlier than they normally had. But look, all they did here was kick the can down to March. And so, you know, they agreed on a $1.66 trillion deal. They'll likely pass it today. But the same situation that we're facing right now will come back March 1st and March 8th. March 1st being when 4 out of the 12 appropriation bills are at threat of shutdown. And I would also note that there are only 4 days in February where both the Senate and the House are in session on the same day. And so the lawmakers aren't even going to be in Washington come February. So this is going to be a challenging March because you've got March 1st and March 8th, and also on March 7th, you have the State of the Union. So what are the market impacts? Well, you know, usually with government shutdowns, there aren't usually all that much markets need to be worried about. But in this case, we have a deadline of April 30th. If we are operating under a continuing resolution, kicking the can, if you will, by April 30th, there's a 1% sequester, 1% cut, and that also goes to the Department of Defense, and therefore contractors are not going to be happy. Now, we don't think this is going to happen, but certainly to keep in mind as we get closer to that March date, will they try and kick the can again? That may not be good for those defense stocks.
I mean, kick the can really seems to be the theme of how our Congress operates. Is there ever going to be a time when this will be resolved and we won't have to be at more or less like constant threat of the government shutting down?
Well, eventually, you know, nobody's going to want to shut the government down during an election year. So there will come a point where, 435 members of the House are going to say, look, I'm tired of this. I don't want to deal with this. I want to be back in my district, because every day they spend in Washington is another day that somebody running against them is back in their district. So I think eventually they will come to an agreement and they'll say, look, here's what the funding for the rest of the year is going to look like. But, you know, this kick the can mentality is difficult for markets because nobody knows what's going to happen, and you have bad headlines and so forth like that. I will say the best news for the markets in this case is that the debt ceiling doesn't come back until after the election. And so, you know, really for the rest of the year, we're going to have to live through these shutdown threats. Eventually they'll make a deal, but ultimately very little impact to the market.
So just give me the update. The Senate, there was unanimous consent, and now the House has to, what's happening?
Yeah, so the Senate is expected to vote probably just in the next hour or so, and then that's going to go to the House. The House is going to try and vote on it later. Don't be surprised if President Biden doesn't sign this till tomorrow. He's supposed to be in North Carolina later today, so I think eventually he'll come back and sign it tomorrow. But ultimately, this doesn't really do anything other than just taking this interview that we're having right now and putting it again in March. So, you know, I will say, though, that when it comes to the March 1st and the March 8th deadlines, when it comes to the March 1st, if you are a commodity trader that utilizes reports from the Department of Agriculture, that's one of the first departments that will shut down.
What movie was that? Trading Places.
Exactly. Exactly. So if you're in the commodity trading space, you know, that March deadline may be a little bit more important to you just because there's going to be data that you probably utilize that won't come out. But the March 8th deadline is the one that we think will get Congress. If there was a shutdown in March, it's really that March 8th deadline that's going to get Congress to say, we need to get something done. We need to figure it out. Oh, by the meanwhile, President Biden gives his State of the Union address on March 7th, so he may want to make some comments there as well.
So that data that comes from Commerce, HUD, Census, BLS, that would all be okay? So just ag that would be affected?
No. So on the March 1st deadline, it's only 4 out of the 12 appropriation bills. So it's departments like agricultural, transportation, and energy. Now, the rest of them come on March 8th. So Department of Defense, Commerce, and so forth like that. But when it comes to a government shutdown, let's say we had a multi-week shutdown. I don't think this will happen. But if you have a multi-week shutdown, most contractors are actually protected because the length of their contracts go out 12, 18 months, 2 years, and so forth like that. So from a planning perspective, you're not going to be able to work with your counterparts at the government, But in terms of financing, you'll be okay. Obviously, smaller contractors, folks that get furloughed and so forth, there is a bigger risk there. When it comes to the reports, however, essentially when the government shuts down, they're not allowed to actually touch their email. They're not allowed to touch their phone. It's as of this moment, you're no longer working. And so therefore, the reports that a lot of traders utilize and a lot of reports the Federal Reserve utilizes just would be delayed.
All right, so border security and Ukraine, funding for Ukraine, how does that fit into all this? Where is that?
So this is an ongoing negotiation that is separate from the government funding fight. Now, there are some folks that had hoped to try and tie the two together, but that's not actually what's occurring here. So President Biden hosted congressional leaders at the White House this week to try and come up with more of a game plan of how to move forward on this. Now, we've heard a little bit more optimism in the Senate on border security. We've seen Senator Lindsey Graham out there talking about how the need to get a deal done is now. However, when it comes to the House, that's really where a lot of the more mystery lays here. So we do think eventually a border agreement in the Senate can get done. We think that a Ukraine deal can get done, an Israeli deal can get done. The question is, how much does that go, and how much does the House want to actually change this? Or just say, look, I think President Trump's going to win in 2024 in November. I'm just going to pick up my toys and then come back next year and see if I get a better deal. That's all I hear at play. Most important for us, though, what we're tracking at BI is that Ukraine deal. Because if President Biden gets around that $43 billion number that he asked for, my colleague Will Lee put out a great report saying that the defense contractors, the Raytheons, Northrop Grumman's, and so forth, if you will get around a 1 to 2% revenue increase over the next few years as a result of that Ukraine deal.
One last quick one here for you, Nathan. I mean, a lot of this, I got to wonder, where's the House Freedom Caucus at? And is there, still another threat to the speakership of Mike Johnson?
So there's always going to be a threat, but Speaker Mike Johnson did essentially call their bluff by saying, look, I'm going to stick to this $1.66 trillion deal. And the question is, will this House Freedom Caucus decide to try and vacate him? But they've already gone through all the candidates. I don't know who else it would be. And so, we've seen statements from moderate Democrats saying that they potentially could offer support. Obviously, that support would come with a condition. But I think Speaker Johnson has essentially said, look, nobody wants to go through 3 weeks of trying to pick a speaker again. I dare you to try and vacate me. Obviously, he only has a couple of votes that he can lose. But like I said before, a lot of these House members are going to start thinking about the elections. They don't want to be in these intra-party fights and so forth like that, especially when somebody back home is saying, look at Washington, look how inept they are, vote for me instead.
All right, Nathan, that's always great. You're the expert from the nation's capital, Nathan Dean of Bloomberg Intelligence. Some reason for optimism with the continuing resolution. Massimo is doing something of a victory lap after the company's win in the legal battle with Apple to take its blood oxygen monitor off the Apple Watch. Massimo's CEO, Joseph Kayani, sitting down right now for an interview with Bloomberg Television and Ed Ludlow. Let's listen in to the Massimo CEO.
We could work together, that's fine. If not, I'd rather compete in the marketplace with my technology, not in Apple's products.
Joe, just to be clear, in the context of Massimo, the company, because there are other executives, I'm sure you have strong internal legal counsel and outside counsel. There have no conversations taken place at all between your company representatives and Apple company representatives.
Well, no executives are talking to Apple. None of the Apple executives are talking to us. There are court-ordered mediations that I can't get into that have been held before, and there will be additional meetings probably in the future. But those are not meetings that I consider steps towards settling litigation. As you know, Massimo, being the inventor of measured through motion and low precision pulse oximetry, successfully sued and won 2 other big cases that took each 6 to 7 years. One with Nellcor, which is part of Medtronic, one with Philips. Once we got an injunction on Nellcor, the CEO of, at the time, Tyco Healthcare called me, apologized, and said, would I meet to settle? And we met, and within 30 days we settled. Those kinds of calls have not happened.
And Joe, we will get to the technology discussion in a moment, but you are the CEO of Massimo. Last year, you had around $2 billion of sales. That's about 5% of the segment Apple reports that includes wearables. So it has been hypothesized that a licensing agreement or royalties is one possible outcome. That must be something that you are pushing for hard because it would have a material or needle-moving impact on your sales.
It takes two to tango. Whether we want it or not, it's got to be both parties that want it. There are positive reasons for both of us to have it. Probably the biggest positive is the consumers getting a reliable, accurate pulse oximeter, no matter whose watch they're wearing. But yeah, while I would be happy to have a settlement that's a win-win, I did not file this litigation because of that. I did it because, first of all, principally, it's wrong what Apple does, taking smaller companies' technologies. And in our case, they stole our people, they stole our patents, and they stole our property. So I had no choice as to go after them. I'm the CEO of Massimo, and I have to defend Massimo's intellectual property. And in our case, as you know, we make products. You just mentioned we have $2 billion in revenue. The wearable market is a $50 billion revenue. We make the most accurate and reliable pulse oximeter. Even when Apple was making their watch, they thought the most important feature of the watch is pulse oximetry. I have that. I have the medically FDA-cleared product, and it really works. So I intend to get in the marketplace and hopefully gain our rightful share of the market.
We showed Apple's statement on the screen a moment ago, but in summary, Apple fundamentally believes that the patents are invalid in the first place in the context of this ITC battle and the associated court battles, and that Apple fundamentally believes they do not infringe them, that their products as they are today do not reflect what is reflected in the patents. So you make two competing arguments here. How are you going to prove the opposite is true of that statement that I've just summarized from Apple?
We're no longer alleging Apple infringed our patent. Apple has been proven to infringe our patents. And not only the ITC, which the judges, our patent lawyers, reviewed, had a hearing, looked at the evidence, and found our patents to be valid and infringed, but even PTAB, that generally kills 80 to 90% of patents that are brought in front of them in an inter-party review exam, found these patents to be valid. In fact, it's funny because when the judge ruled in our favor, Apple told the commission, which is the commission's full appeals group, that, hey, don't pay attention to what your judge did. The real expert is PTAB, and they're going to invalidate Massimo's patents. I think 2 weeks later, they did not. And then they said, no, we only meant you should look at that if they found Massimo's patents to be invalid. No, our patents are valid. We are the inventors of this technology. My co-inventor went to Apple and took this technology to them. The only two companies that had this convex shape correcting for light piping so that you can get accurate pulse oximetry were Massimo and Apple. I wonder why.
Joe, I'm focusing on the ITC decision and ban from October because that is the latest, right? That the action Apple has to take today, selling the Series 9 and Ultra 2 with the functionality disabled, directly relates to that process. So that's why I'm focusing there. And in the original ITC decision from October, you submitted 5 patents in the context of that case, right? The ITC, as you say, found that 2 Apple had infringed, and within those 2, you were allowed to proceed with 5 claims. But in all, you made more than 100 claims, and the ITC allowed you to move forward with 5. To play devil's advocate, how is this not to be interpreted as just throwing everything you can at Apple to see what sticks?
Well, first of all, in the entire history of Massimo, and we've had 2 major litigation, none of our patents have ever been invalidated. In 2012, under the American Invents Act, PTAB was created to look at people filing processes to kill people's patents. But unfortunately, they created what is known as is not clear and convincing evidence to kill a patent, but preponderance of evidence. And that is why 80 to 90% of people's patents are getting killed. And Apple happens to be the #1 customer of PTAB. So focusing on the ITC case, focusing on this particular litigation, none of our claims were invalidated. ITC itself found our patents to be valid. Some of them they didn't think Apple infringed. Some of them they thought they did. And some of them they thought we didn't have domestic industry on. So no, we have not thrown our patents against the wall to see what sticks. We've been in business for 35 years. I'm one of the co-inventors of this technology that's revolutionized pulse oximetry, that saved babies' eyesight, that has helped people not die of opioid overdose in post-surgical wards. Over 200 million people a year are monitored with our technology. And when Apple wanted to make their pulse oximeter, what do? They went and hired my team, as many of them as they could, to develop it for them. So I think this narrative is false. And given that Apple was found to infringe, not just by the ALJ, by the commission, several agencies for President Biden reviewed this to see if they should intervene. They didn't. And the Court of Appeals just enjoined them during the appeal process. To have someone say to me, oh, Apple thinks your patents are invalid. Well, you know what? They have their own, what do they call it? They call it this fake reality. I read it in the biography of Steve Jobs. They can live in that reality if they want. But really, should the rest of us?
Joe Chiani, Massimo CEO, we're grateful for your time. And I think that what it's clear you and Apple agree on is that pulse oximetry can confer a real benefit from a healthcare perspective to the consumer. One of the arguments that the consumer might make, and was flagged to me on social media when I said you were coming on the show, is that there are people that want to buy the Series 9 and Ultra 2, right? Apple has a great installed base of devices around the world. And there are consumers, therefore, that may or may not put off buying that product because Apple is not able to allow the functionality in the context of blood oxygen. You know, explain your thinking on that to me about access to the technology and where current proceedings inhibit that for the consumer.
Thank you for asking me that question. I'm glad one of your audience did ask that, because this is actually really important to me. I have dedicated my life to helping improve people's health care. And I've done it through our innovation. I've done it through advocacy, philanthropy. So when someone says, hey, you took this away from me, I can't buy it anymore. Certainly the people who already have it, they can keep it. It really bothers me because unfortunately, this is one of those alternative universes that Apple has created. In their own internal documents, Apple knew their product wasn't good enough to be relied on medically. They knew it wasn't good enough for them to seek FDA clearance. But literally, they said, and this was in 2020, in the chaos of COVID, this is quotation in their document, if we launch pulse oximetry with our watch, we'll gain market share from Fitbit. That's why they launched it. Their own testing showed it measured twice a day at best on 37% of the population. Pulse oximetry is not useful unless it's a continuous monitor. Bad things happen during sleep. During sleep, you can have a desaturation that might be to apnea. You could have a dangerous desaturation that might be to opioid pain relief you may have taken. That's where the value comes. Our product, which is FDA cleared, can actually do 70,000 plus data points a day. It's a continuous, accurate pulse oximeter. So unfortunately, Apple is masquerading what they're offering to consumers as a reliable medical pulse oximeter, even though it is not. And I really can wholeheartedly tell you the consumers are better off without it. If they really need pulse oximetry on their wrist, they should buy ours, or they should find another solution that really is accurate and reliable, not something that gives you 2 measurements a day at best.
Joe Chiani, Massimo CEO, we're grateful for your time on the program and for bearing with in what is a complicated process and legal proceedings. Thank you so much.
Massimo CEO Joseph Chiani, along with Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. And just wrapping up that discussion, that brings us to 12:43 on Wall Street. This is Bloomberg Markets. I'm John Tucker, along with Molly Smith. Let's bring in our next guest. My question is for you, Molly. Do the rich invest differently than schmoes like me?
Well, you have to define the rich, as our next guest is going to, because there are the mere mortal millionaires, and then there are billionaires, and then there's a nice group in between called the centimillionaires. We're going to learn a lot more about them.
Barbara Goodstein is the CEO at R360, catering to the investment needs of high net worth individuals. Thanks for stopping by in the studio. What does R360 do, first of all?
So R360 is a community.
Let me bring this mic closer to you there. Real close to that. There we go.
It's a community for ultra high net worth wealth creators and their families who are trying to navigate the challenges of having these very large family enterprises. And so we bring this community together and people meet and talk about opportunities and challenges.
Why do they need to come together? Because when I become an ultra high net worth individual, I don't want to talk to anybody.
Well, you would be surprised. You actually would want to talk to people because, first of all, that level of wealth can be isolating, but even more importantly, people are getting ideas from each other. We have some of the most successful people in the country, and they're sharing ideas on macro global trends with each other, and then they're all benefiting from hearing those different ideas.
So tell us about who some of these, quote, centimillionaires are, and those are people that have at least $100 million in wealth.
That's right. So one of the people that we have in our network is one of the largest hedge fund managers in the country. And he has been very vocal educating our group about the benefits of investing in Bitcoin. And had I listened to him, I would have tripled my money. He told us that 3 things are going to happen, that Bitcoin is going to be marked to market, and it was in January, that ETFs were going to come out, and they just did. And now we have a phenomena called halving, and that's going to happen in April of this year. And he told the group that this is going to generate enormous growth and opportunity in Bitcoin. So that's the type of person that we have in the group.
These are people who inherited their wealth, or they actually made the money with hard work and starting a business?
So it's actually both. We have a lot of wealth creators. We also have some people who have inherited the wealth, and now they're extending the business that they inherited through the next generation. So we have both.
And these are, so a lot of this is what they're talking about with each other. You said like macro ideas. I don't think, though, that these people really want to share where their money's being invested, though, right? Like, does that come up at all?
Well, they actually are happy to share with each other. And that's the fascinating part about this community. Everybody's sharing lots of information, personal information, as well as investment information. And so, again, we've got another member who has written 6 books on theoretical physics, and he's got a PhD in quantum computing.
I think I know who this is, actually.
And he's been advising everybody to invest in quantum computing, and there's going to be an enormous rise there. Russia and China are creating something called hack-proof quantum computing, and so we're now looking at investing in South Korea Telecom has built an alternative to that. So,
okay, so what, as an individual investor myself, what can I learn from them?
So I think you could learn about, again, macro global economic trends, things that are coming. So we are very focused on the defense area. We think that there's going to be an enormous increase in defense spending across the world, and we've already seen it. Poland just bought 1,000 tanks from South Korea. That's more than Germany, France, and the UK combined. And that is small compared to what's about to happen in the United States and Russia. So if you're interested in global defense spending, there are a lot of opportunities in that space.
What happens, Barbara, if your net worth changes so substantially that either you've been now minted as a billionaire, or maybe you're less fortunate and fall into the low single digits of just millionaire status? Can you still be in this club?
So we actually have a lot of billionaires in the club. So the average net worth is $400 million. The minimum requirement is $100 million. So we have a number of billionaires, and the priority in this group is to find people that share the same values. These are people who want to go from prosperity to purpose. They're going from having built extraordinary lives to building extraordinary legacies. So that's the priority, is finding people with the same values and the same interests.
You're talking about philanthropic endeavors?
Yes, many of these people are uniquely philanthropic. We have people that one couple is building the largest foundation to support cochlear ear implants in their states. We have another person who's the largest employer of people with disabilities in her state. So a tremendous philanthropy, and one of the requirements is that people have the same values, that they're not coming there to use each other, they're coming there to build this community and share with each other.
Barbara, I wish we had more time. Barbara Goodstein, the CEO at R360, catering to the investment needs of high net worth individuals. Thanks for stopping by the studio.
Thank you.
Pleasure to see you. Let's get the market reset right now. S&P 500 is 12 points higher. That's up 0.3%. 47.51 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is down 50 points. That's a decline of about 0.1% right now. Text the story today. The NASDAQ 100 up 157 points. That's up about 0.9% right now. As far as yields, the 2-year 435, I'm going to call it unchanged right now. The 10-year up 4 basis points at 414. And that brings us to 1250 on Bloomberg Markets. I'm John Tucker along with Molly Smith. Time for company news now. And with that, here's Steve Rappaport.
John, shares of Humana plunged 13% to the lowest level in nearly 2 years. That's after the healthcare provider slashed its adjusted earnings for 2023. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle has more.
This has to do with rising costs as there's been an uptick in care usage by seniors that started a trend that started mid-year last year. This is also a warning call for Medicare Advantage plans. That's a private version of the U.S. healthcare program for seniors. It's driven growth and profits for some of these insurers for years, and it now seems as though it's slowing.
That's Abigail Doolittle reporting. Right now, Humana stock is down more than 11%. Shares of Boeing are up after the aircraft maker scored a big order. Details on that from Bloomberg's Jeff Bellinger.
Steve, this is very welcome news for Boeing. India's newest airline has placed an order for 150 Boeing MAX jets. These are firm orders for 737 MAX 10 and MAX 8-200 planes from Akasa Air, which began commercial flights less than 2 years ago. The planes are to be delivered over the next 8 years. It's noted that this order does not include the MAX 9 variant that was involved in this month's incident, in which a plug panel on an Alaska Airlines jet blew off shortly after takeoff. Steve?
Thanks, Jeff. Google has laid off over 1,000 employees across various departments since January 10th, and The Verge reports more may be coming. It reports an internal memo Wednesday. Employees were told to brace for additional cuts. And those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Steve Rappaport.
You're listening to Bloomberg Markets on Bloomberg Radio.
And I'm John Tucker, along with Molly Smith. We are in for Paul and Matt. Right now, let's get an update on news from around the world. And we head to the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. That's where we find Nancy Lyons. Hi, Nance.
Hey, John, thanks. A fresh blanket of snow is expected across 18 states from Wyoming to New York today and tomorrow. Over a dozen Acela trains operating along the Northeast corridor between Washington, D.C. and Boston have been canceled in their entirety for today. That's according to Amtrak. All service alongside the Empire Builder line has also been canceled today and tomorrow. These new storms will be followed by a new blast of Arctic cold stretching from Minnesota to the Deep South. The House Committee on Homeland Security is holding a second impeachment hearing today against Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Republican lawmakers have been focusing on the high levels of unauthorized migration across the southern border, while Democrats say the proceedings are a sham. Here's a Republican House Homeland Security Chairman, Mark Green.
Because of Secretary Mayorkas' border crisis, American cities and neighborhoods are less safe. Secretary Mayorkas' refusal to enforce the law, which requires him to detain and remove illegal aliens, has tragically increased crime and endangered public safety across the country.
Green's words concerning Mayorkas are being disputed by the White House that calls the push to impeach the Homeland Security Secretary unconstitutional. Bloomberg has obtained a document that says House Republicans plan to advance an impeachment resolution against Mayorkas on January 31st. King Charles of England is set to be admitted into the hospital next week for a corrective procedure on a benign enlarged prostate. The Queen gave an update today on the monarch's health.
How is His Majesty? He's fine, thank you very much.
Thank
Looking forward to getting back to work. Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Meanwhile, Prince William visited his wife, Kate, in the hospital earlier today, where she is recuperating from abdominal surgery. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now back to you, John and Molly.
All right, thanks, Nance. Appreciate it. I'm John Tucker, along with Molly Smith. Among one of the most read stories on the Bloomberg has to do with a City trader departing City. All right, who
For
cares?
charitable reasons.
That's
John.
the good part of the
Yes.
story, and it's kind of heartening that so many people have picked up on this story on the Bloomberg terminal.
And our last guest really set us up so well for this, describing people who have built this massive fortune and are now turning from, as Barbara just called it, prosperity to purpose. And that's what sounds like Citigroup's Marcus Satha is doing. It seems like he was big in the firm's short-term interest trading desk.
Well, not only big, but
he led
built it into
20-year veteran of Citi. He's been around the company for a while, and now he is turning to focus on a children's book charity that I believe he founded. Yeah, founded it 2 years ago, that says it helps, quote, source expertly reviewed, high-quality books for children that reflect the diverse world in which they live. So this is about showcasing inclusive books for different ages, and also showing children's books that feature animal or non-human characters, and also ethnic minority main characters as well.
Yeah, it's a fantastic charity, hoping to combat the fact that the proportion of kids' books published featuring animal or non-human characters is far greater than books starring ethnic minority main characters, this is, at least according to the website. So a little more diversity. What was your favorite child's book?
Probably
Don't say
what's the
Green
one
Eggs
with
and Ham.
what's the one with the Goodnight Moon? There we go.
Moon.
Classic.
That's you know what? You ever see the Wall Street Journal story a few years ago on the author and the illustrator of that?
No, what was it?
Well, it was like the money was still coming in. They had passed away, and the money was still coming into, I believe it was the illegitimate son of the author or the illustrator, and how the guy was, it was like something like $400,000 a year.
Oh my
still
gosh.
the residuals, and the guy would just blow the money.
Wow.
He'd buy a condo and just leave it and go to another city and buy another.
Well, that sounds like purpose to prosperity
it
for
was a
that guy.
great
Maybe the
story.
flip side.
Anyway, I digress. Molly Smith, John Tucker with you. Stay with us, because Bloomberg's Sound On, that starts right now.
Now, from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover that.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
Was the Republican race over before it began? Welcome to the fastest show in politics. Back in Washington, D.C. with new polling out of New Hampshire showing a commanding lead for Donald Trump and slowing momentum for Nikki Haley in what was supposed to be Haley country. We're joined ahead by Chris Galdieri at St. Anselm College in New Hampshire that did the research. Later, we'll talk with Republican Congressman French Hill of Arkansas about whether we will avoid a government shutdown on Friday. There are new questions that we'll talk about and chances as well of a border deal following the meeting of the minds yesterday at the White House. We'll have analysis from our signature panel. They're back with us. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano along for the ride. As we first check Wall Street, let's get up to date on trading right now with Charlie Pellet. Hey, Charlie.
And good to see you back in Washington. After a back-to-back slide, the S&P 500 bouncing back today. Little changed, but still green on the screen, up 0.1% higher by 5 points right now on the S&P. We do have the Dow Jones Industrial Average lower by 93. That is a drop right now, just about 0.3%. And the Dow Jones Industrial Average, as I mentioned, lower. NASDAQ higher by 0.6%, up 95. The NASDAQ 100 index up 124, higher now by 0.7%. 10-year yield 4.15% with a 2-year that's now yielding 4.35%. Gold up $9 the ounce, back at 2016, a gain there of 0.5%. West Texas Intermediate crude higher by 2.2%, 74.19 a barrel on WTI. So a rally in some of the world's largest tech companies, fueling a rebound in stocks. Traders also weighing the latest economic data and Fed speak for clues about the central bank's next steps. The World Economic Forum is underway in Davos. Bloomberg Radio is there. This morning we caught up with Bank of America CEO Brian Moynihan, and our Jonathan Farrow and Lisa Bromowitz asked him if he could ever see himself with a future in Washington.
I've got a big job, and I have a fun job, more importantly, and I got a lot of years ahead.
Doesn't sound like fun down in Washington.
I'll let you be the judge of that. But I think in the end of the day, look, I do what I do. I love doing it. We have a great company, and it's fun to do. But at the end of the day, we need good people serving Washington. It may not be me, but we need good people to serve there.
And that's what we've got you covered on right here on Sound On. You can hear more of the conversation with Brian Moynihan on the Surveillance Podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcast. Activist investor Nelson Peltz has renewed his attack on the Walt Disney Company. Peltz says Disney is unable to heal, quote, self-inflicted wounds under current leadership and should be aiming for, quote, Netflix-like margins. Disney shares are up right now by 1.4%. Again, recapping, S&P higher by 6, up 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Right, Charlie, thank you and welcome. As we get started here with the Thursday edition of Bloomberg Sound On, I'm Joe Matthew. Back in Washington, D.C., at least for a moment, we're New Hampshire bound this weekend, and for good reason, as we head for the first in the nation primary, and we'll bring you special coverage from the Granite State. Real doubts today about the so-called momentum behind Nikki Haley that we were talking about just a week ago. Quite a bit has changed since the Iowa caucuses, and a new poll by St. Anselm kind of says it all. Finding, as I read in the headline, Trump now enjoys majority support within likely New Hampshire Republican presidential primary voters. We saw a blowout win, of course, in Iowa, and there are questions about what this might look like. Remembering, again, it was just a week ago people were talking about a potential win for Nikki Haley. Now Governor Chris Sununu is talking about a strong second, and that's where we begin our conversation today. Before we turn to our panel, and I'm looking forward to having Kristen Hahn on board with us. Jeannie is off today, and we'll be back tomorrow. Chris Galdieri, one of the political voices we turn to in New Hampshire, a political scientist and professor at St. Anselm College, which again cranked out this poll. It's great to see you, Chris. We're almost there. And I wonder your thoughts on what we're seeing today, because your poll importantly reflects the departure of Chris Christie. And it looks like those votes, at least a majority of them, did go to Nikki Haley, but not enough to make a difference.
That's right, and I think I think the Iowa result took some of the wind out of Haley's sails. Her campaign had been talking about potential second place finish, DeSantis being in a distant third, and instead that's not what happened. Trump won by a huge margin in Iowa, but DeSantis finished ahead of Haley. And she has really struggled, I think, to find her footing after that. She talked about it being a two-person race, but, DeSantis, he's still in this, but he is down in South Carolina and talking about Super Tuesday. I just think, this poll suggests that, Haley might have hit her ceiling and maxed out her support that's out there.
It's an interesting scenario to kind of peak early in New Hampshire, since it's so early in the process. But so people know what we're talking about here. Donald Trump at 52%. That's up 7 points since last week. Up 7. Also up 7 is Nikki Haley. And that would reflect what we saw with the Christie votes moving around. I think you might agree. That's 38%. Yeah. So 52-38. That's a big spread here, Chris. What did you think yesterday when you heard Chris Sununu talk about a strong second? Because we've got to be honest, they were talking about winning this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, unless it's a strong second, like, remember the 2012 Iowa caucuses where there was like 7 votes between Romney and Santorum? I think anything short of that is going to be a really significant blow to the Haley campaign. To go from talking about winning to talking about a strong second, I mean, you don't want to be the candidate who's talking about a moral victory or placing a really, really robust, strong second, because winning's the name of the game. And, in this sort of sequential primary system, there's not another state in the union that's as tailor-made for Haley to do well as New Hampshire. I mean, if she can't do it here, I struggle looking at the rest of the map to see other states where she's going to pull off an upset.
Well, and a lot of folks are saying even if she won New Hampshire that there might not be a path here. And I realize a lot of things can change overnight when you win New Hampshire. Chris, by talking about moral victories, I'd love to know what it felt like, or what groan you might have heard in New Hampshire when Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis were both on stage in Iowa. DeSantis saying, we got our ticket punched in Iowa, even though it was a distant second. And Nikki Haley, who came in third, says now two-person race because she won one of 99 counties. That's not exactly the momentum you need to fly into New Hampshire.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think there was a lot of willful self-delusion going on those stages on Monday night. DeSantis had the endorsement of the governor. He had the endorsement of Bob Vanderplaats, an extremely influential evangelical conservative leader, and that got him to 21%. Haley had been talking about coming on strong and surging into second place and giving Trump a scare and knocking DeSantis out of the race. And instead, she finished behind DeSantis. It is just, really tough to look at that. And, look, you say what you have to say to get through the disappointing election result. I remember Joe Lieberman coming in 5th and saying it was a 3-way tie for 3rd. And if you're really old, you remember Mike Dukakis saying he won a bronze medal in Iowa in 1988. Remember that?
We got
it's just, look, I mean, winning is better than losing. Sure, sometimes a strong second can help when you've got a close race, when you've got, a delegate hunt going on, like, Clinton Obama in 2008. But this isn't that. This is a dominant front runner who won a big victory in Iowa and seems on track for a similarly sized victory in a state where, it's the best case for somebody else to win. And yet Trump seems to be doing quite nicely here.
Well, we're getting a straight deal from New Hampshire today with Chris Galderi at St. Anselm College. Speaking of willful self-delusion, I don't know if he just came up with that on the spot, but that was pretty good. Your governor, Chris Sununu, might have something very much in common with the governor of Iowa, Kim Reynolds. They both went out on the line and endorsed somebody, it looks like, who's not going to win. Isn't that something?
Yeah, it is. It is. And, Chris Sununu, he thought about running for president himself in this cycle and decided against it. And then he spent a lot of the last year sort of courting and boosting all of the other Republican candidates who weren't Trump. He's talked about the need for a non-Trump alternative. And basically, he was, if you were a Republican running for president, he would show up at your events to boost your profile here, and ultimately settled on endorsing Haley. That said, he's also said, well, of course, if Trump's the nominee, I'll vote for him, which I think also sort of stepped on the Haley campaign's message, which is that Republicans need somebody who's not Trump. She's being very gentle in her criticism. It mainly comes down to electability, but she's, made the argument, look, Donald Trump is not popular with the country at large. Republicans, you might love him, but everybody else does not. So go with a fresh face, go with somebody younger, go with somebody without the baggage. So I think for Sununu to say, on the one hand, we have to have Haley as our nominee, and on the other to say, but if it's Trump, of course I'll vote for him over Biden, is just, you're stepping on your own message there.
Not that that is unusual here. We haven't really mentioned Ron DeSantis because, he's unchanged. Isn't that fascinating? In your poll, Haley and Trump are each up 7, still with a wide gap. But Ron DeSantis is stuck in the mud. And it's interesting, he's moving his staff out of New Hampshire now to South Carolina, and is going to be spending half the time between now and your primary in either Florida or South Carolina. So is this over?
I never want to say it's over before voting happens. Events can take place. Meteor could hit somebody's campaign bus or something. But DeSantis, he's in a really tough spot of having been a candidate who came on very strong, had lots of support, had tons of money, and it just all evaporated. It just wasn't enough for him. He staked everything on Iowa. That didn't happen. If he spent a year in Iowa, had the support of the governor and so on, and couldn't get better than 21%, I don't know how he's going to improve on that in some place like South Carolina, where he's barely set foot in the last year. And then once you get to Super Tuesday, I mean, what is the plan there? I just don't see what it is.
Anybody care they canceled the debate after Nikki Haley said she wouldn't go because Trump's not going? Is that being taken personally?
I'm taking it personally. It's like they canceled the prom or something. Come on. But look, it's a huge event. It was a blow to our college that was going to host it. It's an opportunity to put our students, our staff, our campus on the national map. I don't think anybody's like taking it personally, but I think it was a blow to those of us in New Hampshire whose bread and butter is the presidential primary.
I'm glad we finally got it from somebody in New Hampshire. When does the carnival begin? I know Donald Trump's doing the rally, and I remember, by God, we've seen this before. The traveling road show that follows him will occupy downtown Manchester and Elm Street. You're tailgating before this thing. When does it all begin?
I think his Manchester rally is on Sunday afternoon this year. Last year, I think it was the day before the primary, and I think we talked on TV that day. So I got to make my way through that to get to the studio. So that was a little hairy. But yeah, he's doing that. He's doing an event here in Concord on Friday night. What's remarkable about this is he has not done a ton of in-person campaigning here. He's put together a pretty professional campaign organization, but has not done a lot of in-person stuff. And I think he's just really ramping it up. It's really clear that his campaign thinks they can put this away. And so they're pulling out all the stops.
Sure
and in
do.
contrast, Haley's sort of campaigning in second gear. It's just sort of, she did a couple of events.
Strange.
Didn't take any questions, didn't talk to many voters, and it's just kind of mystifying from here.
Strange take. Does Donald Trump ever spend the night, or does he fly home every time he speaks in New Hampshire?
I think he flies home. And of course, this week he's dividing his time between the campaign trail and the courtroom. So that just adds an extra wrinkle to his appearances. That's probably why the rally's on Sunday.
I'll meet you Monday.
All right.
Yes, of course. I'm looking forward to seeing you, Chris. We'll be talking on the ground in Manchester starting next week. I'm sorry about the debate. Now I feel sad about it.
It's okay.
He's at St. Anselm College. I want to meet some of your students while we're there. Chris Calderi in New Hampshire with us here to get things rolling on Bloomberg Sound On. Be well, sir, as we assemble our panel. Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist today, is joined by Kristen Hahn, Democratic analyst, Rock Solutions. It's great to have both of you here. What do you think of this, Rick? What Chris was talking about Nikki Haley almost falling into a second gear, and you see these new numbers from St. Anselm. Is it all over or what? Can't hear you, Rick, unless that's on my end. All right, we're going to go to Kristen. There's just going to fix your audio there, Rick, because I wasn't hearing what you were saying. Kristen, is Joe Biden excited looking at this? He said he wanted to run against Donald Trump, right?
I mean, I think it's going to be tough. I mean, look, Donald Trump, we're having lots of conversations about Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. I think those are going to be over soon. But I don't think anybody's saying that, nobody on the president's team thinks this is going to be a landslide, and we're going to have to work hard to remind people who Joe Biden is. Yeah.
If we've got Rick back with us here, is Nikki Haley
I'm good to go,
running the right strategy going into New Hampshire, Rick?
Look, I thought I thought Chris's point about needing a meteor to even up this score a little bit was probably a good idea. I needed that meteor in a lot of campaigns I ran. But she should be going in overdrive. Forget this second drive. I mean, she should be all out there. I mean, this is what the New Hampshireites love. They love, getting into those town halls and answering the questions and doing 6 of them in one day, plowing through the snow. I'm baffled myself by the second gear.
So what's the job for her then this weekend? I mean, I suppose there's some time. Do you bring in the surrogates? Does she have an army like that to put to work in New Hampshire?
She's got the governor, and the governor is wildly popular and very active on his own, right? I mean, that's her secret weapon. But she has to prove herself to the New Hampshire voters. They don't take surrogates, they want you.
Yeah. They want you, and they want to shake your hand more than once. Kristen, was that a bad move for her to cancel on that debate?
I mean, it made sense, I think, because, she tried to spin her, third place finish in Iowa as this is now a 2-person debate. And if it's a 2-person debate between her and Trump, and she does that, it just kind of looks a little silly. So I think it probably was, her, thinking on this. But it's silly to have these debates without Donald Trump in the room anymore, too. So, I don't
so you understand the logic, but maybe it wasn't the best look. I don't know. We'll figure that out. I want to get into this poll with Rick and Kristen coming up. The poll from St. Anselm. Fascinating numbers here. We've got 2 great panelists with us, and we're going to spend some time on the poll next. Also with an eye on Washington. Are we shutting down on Friday? I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This is Bloomberg.
stocks, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Spirit Airline shares are plunging down another 28% today following that Wall Street Journal report that the airline is exploring restructuring options following the JetBlue deal collapse. Shares of JetBlue, they are advancing now by 3.3%, but the big story we've got Spirit Airlines plunging again by 28.9%. A tech-fueled rebound in stocks lost steam. Traders weighing the latest economic signals, along with Federal Reserve speakers for clues about the U.S. Central Bank's next steps. The S&P right now, little changed, up just about 2 points, up less than 0.1%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average remains in the red, down 82, drop there of 0.2%. The Dow at 37,184. The Nasdaq 100 index up 0.5%, higher by 84 points, while the Nasdaq Composite Index is up 60 right now, again also of 0.4%. 10-year yield 4.13%, with a 2-year 4.33%. Gold up $10 the ounce to 2017, up 0.5%. Bitcoin down 2.5%, 41,577 on Bitcoin, while West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.9%, 73.94 a barrel. So again, recapping, little change for U.S. stocks. S&P up 3 now, a gain of 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
A strong second is the new pitch from the ever-popular governor of New Hampshire, who went out on a limb to endorse Nikki Haley to try to make a difference. May have even convinced Chris Christie to get out of the race. That would be Chris Sununu, who until Iowa was talking about Nikki Haley winning this thing, and that is kind of what has changed here as we look at new polling from St. Anselm College. We're just talking about that with Chris Galdaria. We want to put it to the panel. A great combination today. Rick Davis is back from Iowa with us here, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist, along with Democratic analyst Kristen Hahn, partner at Rock Solutions. Great to have you both here. Rick, your impressions on the poll. We've talked a lot about momentum. We thought it was going to be Nikki Haley's momentum. It appears to be Donald Trump's right now. He's up 7 points now, and just since last week, 52% likely Republican primary voters. And while Nikki Haley scooped up all of Chris Christie's people, or at least a majority of them, it was far from enough to make a difference. Is a strong second the way we should look at this?
Yeah, well, it certainly looks like where we are today. And of course, these polls are just a snapshot in time, right? I mean, the question was, could Nikki Haley's momentum that she clearly had going into Iowa continue coming out of Iowa? And would Donald Trump get a bump if he, surpassed anybody's expectations, which I think his win in Iowa did. So what we're seeing in both this poll and the Globe poll yesterday, very consistent. And both of them have Donald Trump over 50%. Both of them indicated a bounce coming out of Iowa. And even though you're right, I think that Nikki Haley has benefited from Chris Christie getting out of the race. It hasn't seemingly gone much beyond that. And so she's, in a trading range between the middle to high 30s, not enough to get you competitive against the president to win. And I'm sure that's one of the reasons why we're starting to hear from her folks internally, like Chris Sununu, that, setting expectations for a close second would be okay. New Hampshire's a funny place, and it surprises you many times. There are a lot of pollsters who've lost their reputation for being accurate by going and polling in New Hampshire. So I don't think you want to go to the bank with these numbers. Yet I think without a thing like a debate or, any major changes happening between now and Tuesday, it seems to be on this trajectory.
See, there you go. We go again with the debate. She could have had a viral moment tonight. I still say, Kristen, how much stock are you putting in these numbers? I'd like to know how you're reading this poll, because there's some interesting stuff here with 60% of respondents that say they changed who they would support based on candidates suspending their campaigns. That's not just Chris Christie, but I suspect Vivek Ramaswamy. I won't mention Asa Hutchinson. are turning to Nikki Haley. Could we see a late bump here, a late surge for her?
Potentially, New Hampshire is an interesting place. So, it's really, that's why it's so hard. This is why we talk about it so much every time, every cycle, because it's really hard to figure out what these voters are going to do when you have such a high percentage of voters who identify as independents. They can go in and do whatever they want, right? So, and what's interesting, we go back to the debate. If she's not going to debate and spend time, prepping for that, then why isn't she running around that state, going from diner to diner, an event to an event? If she's putting so much stake in this, it baffles the mind. And then even looking forward past New Hampshire to South Carolina, we're all thinking that, all signs point that she's going to get trounced in her home state by Donald Trump. It just, I don't know. Even if she does surge in New Hampshire, it doesn't mean that she's got the resources or has put in the work to do what she needs to do, come South Carolina Super Tuesday, all those things.
Rick, I want to hear from you on this decision by Ron DeSantis to start moving people out of New Hampshire. Most of the staff is redeployed to South Carolina, almost closing the doors on the state here, and he's going to be sharing time between Florida and South Carolina while Nikki Haley's running around New Hampshire. You've been in campaigns that have made late decisions, changes in strategy in the flow here. What does this mean?
Yeah, I think it's just a practical political consideration. First of all, they're doing no good sitting in Iowa. And if you like them, keep them. I moved all of our Iowa team to Florida when I was running the McCain campaign in 2008 because we had a set group already in place in New Hampshire, obviously. And we had a pretty good team, with people like Mark Sanford and Lindsey Graham in South Carolina.
Yep.
And we were naked in Florida. So I was like, I gotta use the resources I got, put people in cars and tell them to drive. They were not disappointed to leave Iowa's cold to Florida's warmth. So I didn't have to pay anything extra for that.
Have you thought out, by the way, people have no idea how difficult it was for people to get out of Des Moines. The airplanes weren't working basically because it was so cold. Nothing was working. Rick, you're home safe, right?
Well, I think that the DeSantis campaign ought to hope that they actually arrive in South Carolina by primary day as quickly as we were able to get out of there. And so, yeah, there's been a lag effect. But look, the real question there is, what in the world does he think he's going to do in South Carolina? Now, I'm moving my people, a practical consideration. He's going to spend time there. Okay, I get it. He's at 6% in New Hampshire. He's not going to be competitive. But he's like at 2% in South Carolina. That's a pretty good leap of faith to go there and look people in the eye, voters, and say, hey, I can win this thing. Especially when all the elected officials are for somebody else. I got to tell you, I think that he is trying to pretend that he doesn't see the future because the future is too bleak to actually see.
Ron DeSantis is unchanged at 6% in this poll, while the two other candidates each gained 7 points here. Kristen, does this end in South Carolina?
Yeah, I think so. People saw who Ron DeSantis is. I always said, you can listen to people, these candidates, like policy priorities, but if you don't like them, people vote with how they feel and how they feel about the character of the person and who the person is. And he showed himself over and over again, in Iowa, the way he would react to the voters, the way he'd react to the press. I just don't see how there's a path forward for him. He's just not likable, and that sounds simple, but it can be as easy as that.
It's interesting to me when we consider, Rick, the exceptions that surround Donald Trump, things that other candidates would have to do to be taken seriously. The fact that he's never spent the night there, and he's going to do a couple more rallies in the next few days, as Chris Galdieri mentioned earlier this hour. He's got a matinee on Sunday. He's got something going on Friday in Concord. He drives all the way back to Manchester, flies all the way back to New York on that jet, just so he can sleep in his own bed to go back the next morning. Could any other candidate get away with that?
No, and no other candidate would want to get away with that. frankly, don't you want a good night's sleep and wake up where you're going to have your next event the next day and not spend all that money flying around? But he did this in 2016, and he did it in 2020. So it's a learned behavior. He doesn't like to sleep outside his own bedroom. If I were his campaign manager, I think I'd be pulling my hair out because it just makes absolutely no sense other than your own personal interests.
You know, Kristen, it reinforces this idea that we've never seen two incumbents, if you will, running in the same race. Because that might be normal for a president, right? He's going to take Air Force One back if Joe Biden's doing an event somewhere, but that's going to be both of them. Just consider the cost of securing both of these exercises and transporting these massive groups of people for the general election.
He doesn't care. I mean, he just, he's not doing this because he wants to connect with anybody. And also, I agree, like if I were his, campaign staff, I'd be pulling my hair out. But he also won Iowa in a landslide and didn't have to do much. He was in court more than he was doing events in Iowa. So, he just defies all, there are no rules when it comes to him.
I guess maybe he has no choice on some days, guys, because he always has to go back to court somewhere the next morning, and that's going to be the narrative for the next year. Great conversation with Rick and Kristen. We're going to turn to Capitol Hill and the White House next after the big meeting yesterday. Two big questions. Are we going to avoid a government shutdown on Friday? And was progress actually made on a potential border deal? You had the big four in the room with President Biden. We'll talk about it next after we update world and national news. For that, we turn to Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Hey, Joe. Another Arctic blast is moving across the country, bringing a new batch of snow. Winter storms are in the forecast for parts of the eastern seaboard, and that's prompted Amtrak to announce the cancellation today of over a dozen Acela trains that operate between Washington, D.C. and Boston. Service alongside the Empire Builder line is also canceled in its entirety for today and tomorrow. Amtrak says impacted customers will be accommodated for departures on another day. A long-awaited report is out from the Justice Department on the police response to the deadly school shooting in Uvalde, Texas. And it does not pull punches, as we hear from Bloomberg's Nathan Hager in Washington.
Cascading failures and no urgency. Those are just some of the words the Justice Department uses about police in its 600-page report on what happened at Robb Elementary School. It says a lack of communication and leadership and inadequate training and technology kept the crisis going far longer than it should have, even as trapped students and terrified parents pleaded with police to go in. 19 students and 2 teachers were killed at Robb on May 24th, 2022. Attorney General Merrick Garland says the victims and survivors deserved better. In Washington, I'm Nathan Hager, Bloomberg Radio.
A House panel is expected to vote on an impeachment resolution of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas on January 31st. The House Homeland Security Committee has been holding its final Mayorkas impeachment hearing today. Republicans say Mayorkas has failed in his job, while the ranking Democrat on the Homeland Security Committee, Benny Thompson, calls it a MAGA spectacle. Mayorkas was unavailable to testify before the committee today. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons.
stocks, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The Dow little changed. We've got tech stocks pushing higher. A tech-fueled rebound has lost steam. However, still looking at a gain for the Nasdaq 100 index of 0.8%. S&P right now higher by 0.3%. The Nasdaq Composite Index up by 0.7, while the Dow remains lower by 9 points, down less than 0.1%. Little change there. S&P 500 came off session highs in afternoon trading as health insurers tumbled after Humana's disappointing forecast. Humana shares, they are plunging today. Right now we have got Humana down by just about 10% for Humana. Some of the other stocks that we are following for you today, we have got shares in JetBlue and also Spirit Airlines following very different paths. Shares in Spirit right now, they are down by 24.7%, and the shares of JetBlue, they are up by about 5.5%. Wall Street Journal report says that Spirit is looking at a reorganization. Weekly jobless claims down again, falling to the lowest in more than a year. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
America's labor market mystified Wall Street forecasts. Robust despite elevated interest rates. Last week, jobless claims dropped to 187,000, the lowest since May 2022. Among states, New York posted the steepest decline. The total number of workers on unemployment also fell for a third week. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
I mentioned the health insurers. Humana down by 10%. Humana plummeting after preliminary earnings missed estimates on higher than expected cost of members' care. Among some of the other health insurance and healthcare stocks, Elevance Health, it is trading lower by 3.2%. Centene Corp down now by 2.9%, and United Health Group is lower by 3%. Again, recapping, stocks are trading higher across the board right now. The Dow back in the green, little changed, up 3 points. The S&P higher by 15, up 0.3%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
The plan has not changed. That's the tweet from Raj Shah, speaking for the Speaker of the House. This is Mike Johnson's spokesman. Raj Shah writes, the House is voting on the stopgap measure tonight to keep the government open, period. He's forwarding a reporter's tweet talking about how Freedom Caucus members want to attach the border policy to this bill, and that would have been a showstopper. We'd be talking about a shutdown. Everything would have changed here. But no, we will be saved by the snow. That's the way it's looking, as the Senate set to pass the stopgap, send it right over to the House before a winter storm arrives here in Washington. I haven't looked in the last 5 minutes, but they've probably canceled my kid's school already, even though a flake has not fallen. Hey, what was that about deadlines? Remember, we can't get anything done. This is what it's come to here now. Apparently, the weather will suffice as we reassembled our panel. Rick Davis is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist, along with Democratic analyst Kristen Hahn from Rock Solutions. That's the way this ends. Right, Kristen? Everybody's got to get out of here so they don't have to touch a snow shovel, and they'll head home for the weekend before the storm. We're not shutting down, right?
No, I don't think so. This is in the House Freedom Caucus. This is what they've done. They have, frankly, just kind of dumb strategies. And, the speaker says he's not beholden to them anymore. They would rather shut the government down, keep everybody here. But whether it's a snowstorm or it's Christmas or Thanksgiving or any other sort of, thing that members want to get home for, that's the deadline. So you're exactly right about that. The only thing that I think is funny about this is that right now, that big tax package that we're all talking about, Ways and Means is still having their markup tomorrow, which means you're stranding these members here for the weekend. So great way to start off a discussion about this tax package by making them all very upset they're stuck in D.C.
Well, Richie Neal's got more snow back in Massachusetts. He's probably better off for it. I'd like to ask you both about this tax deal, but Rick, what do you make of the meeting yesterday? You've got the big four in there with Joe Biden. Apparently, Jake Sullivan made a very detailed, classified briefing on what would happen to Ukraine if there was no border funding. they weren't talking about the shutdown. As we mentioned yesterday, we're not seeing countdown clocks anywhere. This is all done, right? We're going to get through the weekend and we can work on other things.
Yeah, I think the best lobbyist in Washington is named Jack Frost. I mean, I got to get together with that guy someday, get some stuff done. Yeah, this is going to happen. Senate's plowing it done. The House is going to do their thing. There's tons of noise, as we were just saying. I mean, the Freedom Caucus, they just excel at misdirection noise, and that's just another example of that today. They're in the backseat on this one, but I do think the White House meeting was really quite phenomenal. One, smart to have them to come in and talk about Ukraine and Israel, and bring in your senior White House staff to do it in an environment where they can be confidential, and seemingly made some impact on the speaker. And he got his chance, to say, hey, all this has got to depend upon a border deal. And the president smartly said, I'm flexible. You want a deal? Let's do a deal, right? I mean, he didn't push him out of the door without any kind of comment. And so, it actually triggered Donald Trump getting into the act and screaming about it and saying, it's got to be a perfect deal. And I wouldn't do a deal if it wasn't perfect. So like, right. You've had a good day at the White House when Donald Trump attacks you.
Well, I'm curious about the role that Donald Trump is playing in this, and we've been asking questions of lawmakers about it, Kristen. He's talking to the Speaker of the House on the daily, apparently, and he did kick out some words today, a statement that makes you wonder if he will be the one to kill this. Everyone's feeling good coming out of the White House, like Rick said, although it's funny that we're, the way we're parsing all of this, people seem to be feeling good that Mike Johnson is not demanding only H.R. 2 as a border bill. But if Trump tells the troops to vote against this, it's over, right?
Yeah, I mean, immigration is so hard to do. I mean, ask George W. Bush, who, his immigration bill was tanked by his own party in the House. So, I mean, tying it to Ukraine, you see all the comments coming out of like Senator Thune and a lot of the other Republicans in the Senate saying, we have a time here. This is a moment in time where we can actually do this. And Donald Trump seems hell-bent on making sure that doesn't happen. You're already hearing some members of the House on the Republican side saying, we don't, want to cave. We want to wait till Donald Trump is president, that we can get exactly what we want, which is not realistic. So, I mean, maybe I'm a pessimist, but unfortunately, it's hard to see where, the House will do anything unless the speaker decides that he wants to negotiate seriously with the Democrats, because he's going to need a lot of their votes.
Here's what Donald Trump wrote. It's a quote. I do not think we should do a border deal at all unless we get, in all caps, everything needed to shut down the, in all caps, invasion. Also, he writes, I have no doubt that our wonderful Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, will only make a deal that is perfect, all caps, perfect on the border. Is it already done, Rick?
No, I don't think so. Look, I mean, there is an argument that Mike Johnson can make, which is, I want Donald Trump, if he's going to be the next president, to have all the tools that he needs to be able to manage the border. And the more we get now for him, the better we'll be. Look, Donald Trump had an opportunity with a Senate and a House that was Republican to do virtually anything he wanted to. And he got an amazing tax package done. He could have done a deal on the border at the time. He talked certainly enough about it for the 2, 3, 4 years leading up to the election. And he couldn't get it done. So trust me, I mean, Donald Trump's better off if he's going to be president, and all these Republicans think that's going to happen, to get all the laws passed today that he can, so that he can actually start day one fixing the border and stopping the incursion of all these illegal immigrants coming into the United States.
Well, we'll see. We don't have a lot of time to play with when it comes to Ukraine. Based on the briefing they got yesterday, apparently it was scary, and they do have an estimation in the White House when the money runs out what's going to happen. And that's why I do wonder if Mike Johnson has this in mind as he talks to Donald Trump. We'll have some final thoughts with our panel ahead. Kristen Hahn is with us from Rock. Rick Davis, of course, Bloomberg Politics contributor from Stone Court Capital, as Asa Hutchinson gets an apology from the White House. We'll tell you why coming up next on the fastest show in politics. Kaylee's on the way in next, and we'll talk to Congressman French Hill next hour. This is Bloomberg.
your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. The World Economic Forum underway in Davos. Bloomberg Radio is there, and this morning we caught up with the new Morgan Stanley CEO, Ted Pick, who took over from James Gorman this month. And in a wide-ranging interview here on Bloomberg Radio, Pick told us Morgan Stanley is in no hurry to make big acquisitions.
The danger of acquisitions, they're sort of asymmetrically against you, right? Because first, the financial proposition has to work, the business strategy has to work, and then the integration has to work. And we did it twice, right? In COVID, we did E-Trade, which I loved because it kind of gave us enough size. It was dilutive, but that didn't matter. It gave us enough size that we're going to make it. And we saw how things can get in March, and then the aftermath in Europe. And then Eaton Vance gave us solutions. So stuff is going to come across the transom. I'm not sure we need to be in a rush.
Morgan Stanley down 0.8%. By the way, you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, on the Bloomberg, you can find complete Davos coverage under NI Davos. Spirit Airline shares are plunging following that Wall Street Journal report that the airline is exploring restructuring options following the JetBlue deal collapse. Right now, we've got Spirit shares down 20%. As for shares of JetBlue shares are gaining today. Right now, JetBlue is up by 6.1%. Humana plummeting after preliminary earnings missed estimates. Humana shares today, they are trading lower now by 10%. Those are our top company stories at this hour, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
We're live from Washington once again on the fastest show in politics, and we've got a great hour coming with Congressman French Hill, among others. Kayleigh Lyons will be here in 5 minutes. Let's get up to speed on world and national news first. Nancy Lyons has that from the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Hey, Joe. The Justice Department has released a scathing report today outlining what's described as cascading failures of leadership during the 2022 mass shooting at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. The report documents several critical failures and breakdowns prior to, during, and after the incident by responding officers. It took 77 minutes to breach the classroom after the first officers arrived on the scene. Attorney General Merrick Garland says the victims deserve better.
Law enforcement officers from different agencies who had self-deployed to the scene in overwhelming numbers were themselves waiting for leadership decisions about how to proceed. Many officers reported that they did not know who, if anyone, was in charge, what they should do, or the status of the incident.
Garland says he briefed families ahead of the report's release. 19 students, 2 staff members were killed in the incident. President Biden is traveling to North Carolina today to tout how the bipartisan infrastructure law is expanding internet access. North Carolina is a state that Biden desperately wants to win in this year's election. The New York writer who accuses Donald Trump of defamation following a sex assault has concluded a day and a half of testimony. E. Jean Carroll took questions from her attorney as well as Trump's attorney today. Trump has already been found guilty of defamation and of libel for sexually abusing Carroll decades ago in a department store dressing room. She's seeking $10 million in damages. Trump was not in court today. A new poll shows just over half of Americans were thriving in 2023. A Gallup survey found over 52% of Americans evaluated their lives positively enough last year to be thriving. That's a decline from previous years where between 52 and 55% of Americans were shown to be thriving. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg. Now back to you, Joe.
Nancy, thank you. The White House wants Asa Hutchinson to know that it's sorry. Now, you may not have heard that Asa Hutchinson dropped out of the presidential race. It just happened last week. He actually went to Iowa, where he was getting very little support, and ended up with 100-something votes when the thing was over. And so, big joke there for the Democratic National Committee, kicking out a statement following his departure. Quote, "This news comes as a shock to those of us," they wrote, "who could have sworn he'd already dropped out." Well, that's not nice. And so the White House took the unusual step, I understand, of apologizing. The chief of staff himself, Jeff Zients, reached out to Asa to say sorry. Asa Hutchinson talked about it on CNN.
It just doesn't reflect the best of America whenever you have ridicule or sarcasm that is leading the path. And so I'm grateful for Jeff reaching out to me today. It took his time away, and he apologized, and it meant a lot to me.
Well, now I'm sad. Final thoughts from Rick Davis and Kristen Hahn. Rick, is this not the best lesson of the campaign?
I hope so. I mean, the nicest guy who I've ever seen run for office, Asa Hutchinson, is totally committed to the public career, and he deserves the best treatment this White House can give him.
Kristen, is it possible to be too nice to work in politics?
I don't think so. Asa is tough but nice. My former boss and I worked on the campaign, ran for governor against Asa, and Asa was nothing but, respectful to him. And so I'm glad that the White House did this. Sounds like a staffer, pushed out a statement that didn't reflect the president's priorities. It's not who he is. So, honey attracts more bees, right? I think you can be nice and be in politics. Respectful person. So there you go.
Doesn't always have to be an insult. So snarky in Washington. Great conversation. Kristen Hahn from Rock, thank you. As always, Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributor, our great panel. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Hour 2 starts now. Even though it's a
Now, from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover them.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
Saved by the snow. Welcome to hour 2 of Sound On as lawmakers sprint to the finish today on a stopgap funding bill before a snowstorm arrives in Washington tomorrow. We're going to have details on this plan as Kaylee Lines joins the conversation. I thought we just got out of the snow. It's actually followed us home.
Snowstorm didn't teach Washington to deal with snow any better, so everybody just has to get out of town rather than brave a few inches tomorrow, Joe.
Well, I'll tell you what, Bill Hoagland from the Bipartisan Policy Center will join, a man who gives us a peek behind the curtain at times like these, because we're talking about a potential border deal as well after the Big Four meeting at the White House. And this hour, Congressman French Hill will join, the Republican from Arkansas, steeped in all of this. Kaylee, he's got a couple of issues beyond the border and the budget that we're going to talk about that are screaming for renewal this year, and everybody's about to go home again.
Yeah, FISA is something near and dear to his heart. Obviously, we've seen an extension to a certain point, as so often it is just the kicking of the can down the road, whether it's related to that surveillance or related to just keeping the government funded. But eventually, we reach the can, right? And you have to deal with it.
Yeah, I've got to kick it.
Yeah.
Or maybe replace it with something. We'll see about that as we spend time today in Washington. It's great to be back with you, Kaylee, and we start, as always, on Wall Street. Let's get up to date in New York with Charlie Pellet. Charlie, how's it look?
Now we are higher, green across the screen. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all advancing. A flurry of buying for the Dow, advancing now by less than 0.1%, but the Dow Jones Industrial Average up 29 points. We've got the S&P up 18, higher by about 0.4%. NASDAQ up 124. That is a gain of 0.8%. A rally in some of the world's largest tech names is fueling a rebound for stocks on this Thursday. Traders are also weighing the latest economic data and Fed speak for clues about the central bank's next steps. 10-year yield 4.13%, with a 2-year 4.34%. Spot gold up 0.7%. 2019 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.4%, 74.31 a barrel. As for Bitcoin, it is trading lower now, down 2.9%, 41,365 on Bitcoin. Well, as for the Federal Reserve, what about recalibrating those rate cut expectations? Jim Caron is Chief Investment Officer for the Portfolio Solutions Group at Morgan Stanley Investment Management.
I think that the Fed is likely to cut at least 100 basis points this year. And that's just really to keep things neutral, right? I mean, if inflation's coming down, which it is, the Fed needs to change its nominal policy rate to match what inflation's actually doing. So, clearly the debate is over whether it's 6 cuts, 5 cuts, 4 cuts. Is it more than 6 cuts?
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance Podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Boeing has won an order for 150 MAX jets from India's newest airline, in a rare spot of good news for the American plane maker since a piece of fuselage blew off an Alaska Airlines flight almost 2 weeks ago. Boeing shares, they're up today by just about 4%. Again, recapping, stocks higher, S&P up 19, up 0.4%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, we thank you. Welcome to Hour 2 of Bloomberg Sound On, live from Washington. Kaylee, I was in New York yesterday, which was part of my John Candy trip home in planes, trains, and automobiles, which then became Escape from New York.
Yes,
And I was in the same room. I did succeed. I got back at some point last night. I was in the same room as Charlie Pellet. He almost poked me when he was finishing his newscast, and it was great to see everybody up there, including Tim and Carol, who we're going to start seeing a little bit more often and talking with on Monday. We've got actually pretty big news, because when we come back on Monday, this program will start at noon. It's going to be 12 to 2 Washington time, and we've got some cool surprises in store for you. And amazingly, we'll try to actually do all of that from New Hampshire, because
that's where we'll be.
That's where we'll be. Where we are in sports here in Washington is another question, because it's looking like we will avoid a government shutdown.
Yes.
Normally, we've had countdown clocks on cable news, and people would be holding news conferences, yelling and blaming each other, but everyone's kind of quiet about this. We talked about it a little bit yesterday. They're sliding this thing through today so they can get out of town now before a snowstorm.
I guess third time's a charm, Joe. It was a lot of drama to avoid that first potential shutdown on September 30th.
Learned behavior, maybe.
A lot of drama, November 17th. And now maybe no drama here in January. The first deadline in January, mind you. We're going to do this two-step thing yet again with this current stopgap measure.
But this would replace that, right? So the February date, now it's March 1st and March 8th if they pass this. So we don't have to freak out in February. But that's coming, by the way, 2 days. That'll be 2 days. Or the same week as the State of the Union, right? The 8th, that'd be the night after. Oh, my God. I don't know how we're going to do all that.
Yeah.
Super Tuesday, government shutdown, State of the Union, all in the same week.
And I'm also pretty sure it's March where President Biden is supposed to deliver his budget for the next fiscal year. And we'll just be sorting out the budget for the fiscal year we've already been in for almost 6 months at that point. Anyway.
I'm going to call the boss and get that week off. I think they'll say yes. Mike Dorning is going to come in to talk to us here, because Mike's going to be working overtime that week. Of course, Bloomberg Politics reporter. Hey, Mike, it's great to see you. I'm wondering your thoughts here, since we're not going to shut down. Are we going to get something done on the border?
Well, that's what we're hoping. That's what Senator Schumer keeps holding out, optimism that they'll try to work out something soon. And Joe Biden today was asked about it, and he also was saying that he was hopeful on that. But then you have Donald Trump, who is, the front runner for the Republican nomination. His position as the leading Republican just reaffirmed by the Iowa caucuses, throwing cold water on all of this and saying, hey, Republicans in Congress shouldn't agree to this unless they get absolutely everything they want.
Yeah, this is a question, Mike, we've been bringing up frequently on this program, to what extent the former president is actually pulling the strings of congressional leadership, especially when the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, admitted in an interview last night that he talks to Trump frequently about the border.
Yeah, no, he says he's talking with Trump frequently about a variety of issues. And remember, he was a very loyal Trump follower. He was one of the people who came up with the legal strategy to try to overturn the election. So he's very close with Trump, and a lot of the House Republicans are very closely tied to him. That said, in the past, Johnson has gone along, as he just did again, with keeping the government open and avoiding a shutdown. You have people like Texas Governor Abbott saying, hey, let's do something on the border instead of keeping this open as an issue. So there is some pressure on Republicans to actually do something and not just have a pretend fight all year long for the election campaign. And same thing on the Democratic side. It's not just that the Republicans are holding hostage the Ukraine aid. President Biden has Democratic mayors who are saying, you know, something needs to be done here. And if you look at the public polling, there are a lot of Americans, even Democrats, who want something done on the border. So there's still a reasonable prospect, despite the potential cold water Trump is throwing on things.
Boy, well, I don't know if then we should be encouraged that Speaker Mike Johnson has sort of brushed off this request from the Freedom Caucus to tie border to the stopgap that would keep the government open on Friday, and that would guarantee, I suspect, a shutdown for some period of time if they did that. Is he capable of rebuffing Donald Trump if it means doing something for the good of the Congress or the country here, Mike?
I think he's capable of rebuffing Donald Trump as long as it's kind of a low-key effort by Trump, like some posts on Truth Social or something like that. And while Trump is focusing on other things. But if Trump makes this something that is front and center and is issuing repeated demands, it'll be hard for him to actually openly break with Trump. So as long as this is just something where Trump is throwing a little bit of cold water on things, I think he is capable of breaking and going his own way and trying to do something. He's clearly made the calculation that he does not want a government shutdown if he can avoid it. Well, he's also clearly made the calculation that he's much better off focusing on the border and immigration than anything else. And in fact, all year long, we've been hearing economy is the number one issue. Well, in the entrance polls for the Iowa caucuses, you saw that immigration is now even a bigger issue for Republicans than the economy.
Yeah. That's a really good point. Mike Dorning, Bloomberg Congressional Deputy Editor, thank you so much for joining us. And right on cue, while we've been talking a lot about the House, the Senate now has the votes to pass that stopgap funding bill. And then, of course, we expect it will go right to the House, which will vote on it today. And it's a suspension of the rules, so you need 2/3 of the members of that chamber to pass this.
That's actually a really good point. So I won't drive by. I'll go down the other side of the river after work tonight. I will not go by the airport, is what you're saying, because the mass exodus will be
jet
underway.
fumes will be
Got it.
in the air. Well, joining us now for more on this, before we get to the jet fumes, is Bill Hoagland. He is the Senior Vice President at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Bill, always great to have you on the show. It looks like we're going to get another CR, the third we've seen in, less than 6 months. Are you confident this will be the last?
No, I'm not confident this will be the last. Thank you for having me. But as you say, the Senate, literally as we speak, has just passed 64 votes. So they will send the continuing resolution on the tiering system, March 1 and March 8, over to the House this evening. And as you've already reported, in concern about a possible snowstorm tomorrow, it's interesting how weather impacts policy. The Senate or the House will probably take it up early this evening and try to pass it under suspension this evening. But this is not the last we've seen of this. So we've still got a ways to go. And getting
they've been talking about a year-long CR bill. Well, I just wonder what the options are, because I can't imagine a world in which we figure out how to fund the government for real.
Yeah, the problem with the long-term CR is under the Fiscal Responsibility Act, it triggers some sequesters, and the defense people will not like these sequesters that would be coming along with a full-year CR. But quite frankly, I'm of them as you are in some ways. I'm beginning to think, hey, we're 6 months or half of the way through the fiscal year by March. Let's just admit that we're finished with fiscal year 24. President will submit his budget for the next fiscal year right around then, as you say, around State of the Union address. Let's admit that we finished up fiscal 24 and move on to 25.
But then the 1% cuts kick in, right? So I totally get what you're saying, Bill. Why even bother if you're only talking a few months by the time you actually sort it out? Just start fresh in the new fiscal year. But isn't that problematic?
I think it's problematic because people do not want to have those cuts kick in. And yes, I think the Senate's further along than the House, obviously. But one of the big hangups that I now see coming, and this is maybe it's in the weeds a little bit, in the letter that the new speaker put out on when the agreement was reached basically about 12 days ago to set the top line appropriations for 24. He had one particular piece of language in a letter to his colleagues, which he said, and they will fight to include important policy riders in the House bills. At the same time, Mr. Schumer put out a statement saying we will not accept any poison pills. We're going to see a fight over riders in these appropriation bills that could potentially put us into the position, which I said, maybe another continuing resolution or a CR for the end of the year.
Unbelievable. So we get this done, presumably. There's something we haven't addressed yet, and that's a potential deal on the border. We're spinning a lot of plates right now for a Congress that can't seem to get out of bed in the morning here, Bill. But that meeting at the White House appeared to be at least not depressing. They came out saying relatively nice things because Speaker Johnson is not going to only adhere to H.R. 2. At one point, he said that was it. You know, the immigration bill that Republicans in the House already passed without a single Democrat. You're a creature of the Senate. How concerned is the House about getting jammed by what's going on next door? And will that deal, brokered presumably in the Senate, even have a chance in the House?
Well, I am a creature of the Senate. And yes, there are times when the Senate takes action without the involvement of the House deliberations. And on this particular set of discussions that have been going on, the House has not been involved. And something as important as the border that affects everybody. And I do think that this is a issue that's going to come. Even if the Senate could put together and get an agreement and 60 votes to pass some immigration reform, which obviously the Senate is working very hard to do, and Mr. Schumer and Mr. Connor are all on the same wavelength here, the House has not been involved. And the new speaker is probably going to have a very difficult time of simply taking whatever it is that the Senate sends over, and is fearful, quite frankly, of being jammed. From that perspective, I don't follow the immigration issue as closely as I do on some of the fiscal issues, but I am very concerned that there are House members, and you just had a discussion as it relates to the former president's involvement here, that maybe they want there not to be an agreement so that this becomes a political issue this fall for re-election purposes. While the Senate seems to be on board, and there seems to be some nice, happy talk coming out of the White House yesterday, I think we are still a long way from any kind of an agreement on border issues, particularly on the issue as it relates to parole and the powers given to the president on parole.
Well, Bill, we just have a few minutes left with you, but I'm glad you brought up the 2024 election and its role in all of this, considering that former President Trump posted on Truth Social, "I do not think we should do a border deal at all unless we get everything needed to shut down the invasion. I have no doubt our wonderful Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, will only make a deal that is perfect on the border." And Bill, we know that Johnson and Trump talk frequently. How do you think about the former president in this scenario?
I think the former president, I think Republicans broadly should think about this very carefully as to whether or not any kind of a next Congress, if the next even if the Senate switches and the House may not switch, this may be the best opportunity for any kind of reform of the border in the near future, because I fear that a House made up of Democrats next year, if they take over, which it seems to be the prognosis right now at least, and even if the Senate was to become Republican, I do think that the opportunities for a border agreement is the best time is right now, as opposed to putting it off until next year. And by the way, that's too long anyway. We need to be dealing with this now.
Bill, it's great to see you. Appreciate the straight talk. Bill Hoagland at the Bipartisan Policy Center from just next door here in Washington. We thank you for the insights, as always, Kaylee. A lot of questions after a meeting that was supposed to bring answers.
Yeah, that's right. We know that Speaker Johnson, coming out of that meeting, said the border has to be the top priority. Maybe it's a priority for the Biden administration as well, but so is Ukraine, and therein lies the rub.
How true. Congressman French Hill's coming in next.
Yep.
We'll get this straight from a lawmaker who's in the middle of the action. The Republican from Arkansas will be here next on the fastest show in politics. This is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Best level of the day right now on the Dow Jones Industrial Average, up 71. That is a gain now of 0.2%. S&P up 25, higher now by 0.5%. The Nasdaq Composite Index up 150, up now by 1%. A rally in some of the world's largest tech companies is fueling a rebound in stocks. The Nasdaq 100 Index up by 1.1%. 10-year yield 4.13%, with the 2-year, 4.34%. Spot gold up 0.6%. 2018 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.1%. Activist investor Nelson Peltz has renewed his attack on the Walt Disney Company. Peltz says Disney is, quote, unable to heal self-inflicted wounds. Disney shares up now by 1.8%. Recapping stocks higher, S&P right now up by 0.5%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
This is looking like a done deal, Kaylee. The Senate's got the votes. Congressman French Hill is waiting right now for that bill to come across the rotunda so they can vote on it in the House. Then everybody goes home before the snow. Are we done?
Well, we're not quite at the finish line, and a few members of the House were trying to make some last-minute changes in regard to attaching H.R. 2 or similar border security measures to this stopgap continuing resolution.
Right.
And yet, according to Speaker Johnson's office, that's a no-go. No changes.
That's kind of a big deal. I feel like we're going to look
yeah.
back at that as a moment when he said no to the Freedom Caucus and something actually got passed. But it's not for me to make that judgment. He's with us right now from the rotunda in the Cannon House office building where all the big stuff happens. Congressman French Hill, the Republican from Arkansas. Great to see you, sir. You got your snow boots on?
I'm ready. It's cold. It's colder in Arkansas than it is in the District of Columbia. So we're trying to see if we can finish our work today.
Well, it looks like you got it, right? I mean, I'm expecting that this will arrive in the House and pass pretty easily based on what we're hearing. How about you?
I think so. I think when you saw the cloture vote earlier in the week in the Senate, where overwhelmingly senators were ready to do this very short-term extension to buy more time to get these bills written right, get the negotiations finished, and move the continuing resolution deadline from the 19th, tomorrow, to March 1st and March 8th. I think it's just where we find ourselves in Congress after wasting so much time inefficiently last fall in things like fighting about a spending number that we've already agreed to and trying to throw our speaker out. So that's where we find ourselves.
Well, Congressman, you talk about buying more time. More time has been bought twice. A continuing resolution passed at the end of September, another in mid-November. This will be the third. Are you confident that it will be the last?
Well, of course I can't say that. I can't say it because people have squandered time so ineffectively over the past few months. We had the Speaker McCarthy effort to do this before the middle of November, before Thanksgiving, and instead of doing it, a small group of 8 people threw the Speaker out of his job. And so then Chuck Schumer squandered the time between Thanksgiving and Christmas, not continuing to move forward in the Senate on agreeing to the House spending levels or working on this supplemental appropriation very effectively. So, look, this is where we find ourselves. I hope we can get this work done. I know we can. We should be able to do it because we've agreed to the spending levels, and now each of those appropriations committees, subcommittee chairman, will work on the policy. And this is just what's important to Republicans. We got the spending level that we can live with. Now we want to make sure that we get the policy changes that we want in each of those bills before March 1st.
There's talk of a border deal emerging. We saw the players at the White House yesterday, Congressman, the Big Four, along with President Biden. There seemed to be some optimism coming out of that meeting, but I keep hearing that the House refuses to be jammed by the Senate, and that it could be DOA in your chamber. What do you think?
Hey, Joe, such a good question. I think the meeting at the White House was good for about 4 months in a row. President Biden reiterated that he's happy to change policy at the border and happy to work with Republicans on solutions. He keeps saying that, but we don't get anything on paper and get that negotiated. We've got a leader on this project, a frustrating project. James Lankford, the senator from Oklahoma, is trying to put together a policy that cuts off this flow by compelling President Biden to make these policy changes on asylum and parole particularly. That could cut as much as 70% of the flow. That's the kind of policy change House Republicans are waiting to see in writing.
Well, you talk about getting things in writing, but the Senate seems more optimistic they're going to be able to do that soon. That was at least the message from Chuck Schumer yesterday. Once it is, and if the Senate were to pass this, what's its fate in the House? What is the House realistically going to be willing to vote for?
Well, look, here's what I think a majority of House members want is concrete policy changes by the Biden administration on their southwest border policy. They could do many of those by executive action, but they have not. So President Biden, in the conversation at the White House, offered to do some things by executive action and agree to other things in law with Congress. We need to see that in writing, led in the Senate. We need to see how many Republican senators get behind that effort to support it in the Senate. And I think that will really set the tone when that bill attached to funding for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan comes back to the House.
We've got a couple of things, not just government funding to deal with the seasonal expirations here, Congressman. We've talked about the renewal of FISA, the warrantless spying program that is also up for renewal, and I'm wondering if that's going to get bogged down as well by the debates that are being had here. Nothing seems to have an easy path.
Well, again, on the FISA reform, Speaker Johnson has asked Chairman Mike Turner and Chairman Jim Jordan to put together where there's consensus on that. And let me remind you that the Senate Intelligence Committee and the House Intelligence Committee are fully on the same page for these reforms of the FBI, reforms of FISA to protect Americans' privacy, but maintain our surveillance outside the U.S. Those reforms have bicameral and bipartisan support. So Speaker Johnson has set a timeline for Chairman Turner and Chairman Jordan to reach that conclusion, and we need to pass that before April 19th.
Speaking of things that you'd like to see passed in the House, Congressman, you, of course, sit on the Financial Services Committee. You chaired the subcommittee on digital assets. And last year, you had success in passing 2 bills out of that committee related to cryptocurrencies. My understanding, according to a few reports, Congressman, is you're shopping around some changes to that legislation. Could you detail that for us?
Well, we had what we call our Fit for Purpose for the 21st Century Act that set up the regulatory framework that directs the SEC and the CFTC precisely what to do in the regulation and oversight for digital assets. This is good for innovators, good for American companies, good for consumers and investors. We made all the changes that came out of our markup last July. We're now showing that to our colleagues on both sides of the aisle. And I think that bill is prepared to come to the floor when the Speaker and the Majority Leader are ready for it to be considered. The second bill that you referenced, Kayleigh, is the stable coin legislation. This is how to take a fiat currency, like a dollar, and have a dollar-based stable coin to be used on a blockchain as a payment. That bill also, we've worked with our Democratic colleagues. It has bipartisan support. We are trying to make final corrections to that to also get that to the floor. And we're just continuing those consultations. They've been constructive. They've been bipartisan. So I hope we finish that work soon and can get it also to the House floor.
All right, and one more regulatory matter to ask you about, as I know you've been vocal about this in past hearings, the capital requirements, the Basel III endgame reform for banking. Yeah. There's been some noise around that coming from the Federal Reserve in recent days. Michelle Bowman talking about how it might need to be changed. Christopher Waller, her colleague, was as well. We're actually going to be speaking with Michael Hsu, the acting director of the OCC, later, Congressman. What would you like to tell him about how this regulation should change? Right. The proposal, at least.
This is the Basel endgame that affects capital for large financial institutions. But when you affect large institutions, you affect all 4,000 commercial banks in our country. It has to be pro-American competitiveness, not put us at a disadvantage when we compete abroad. And it has to make sure it doesn't dislocate important business and consumer lending products in our country. Those are the things I would urge the regulators to be very careful about. That's why you've heard concerns from Governor Bowman, Governor Waller, others. And this was the comment period week, came to a conclusion this week. And I'm going through all those to see what are the best parts of the rulemaking and what are the parts that need serious change. And I think my colleagues and I are all focused on that for the next few weeks. We want to make sure the Fed has the right capital structure for our institutions, but we don't want to make America less competitive, and we don't want to dislocate consumers and household and business borrowing needs. We need that in our economy for growth.
Right, Congressman, I want you to know we were channeling you over the weekend in Iowa. It was 20 degrees below zero. There was drifting snow on the. You saw. I can complain all day about it, and I'm going to stop down. But I remember the story that you told us about getting on the road. I think it was your lonely drive to Cedar Rapids. You almost didn't make it to, and we were thinking about God, if French Hill made it, we can do it too.
Worse than that, it was Des Moines to Sioux City over a frozen tundra. So let me tell you, it's cold, but it's the American tradition. I'm glad you now have the medal for making it. Congratulations.
I'm not even sure that's true, but I like the idea. Congressman French Hill, we thank you as always. Say hi to your colleagues there in Cannon. Sounds like a busy day, Kaylee. He knows because he's been there.
Yeah, experienced it.
Before he was in Congress, he was working as a surrogate and an organizer in Iowa.
That's right.
He's been there from the grassroots or the snow roots.
I think our cold was colder than his cold, though. It was a record.
It was a record. You can't
cold
compete
caucus.
with a record. I know.
We were there when the record was set, Joe.
Kaylee, they can never take that from us. Let's get up to date on world and national news now. Nancy Lyons has that in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Hey, Joe, the victims of the Uvalde shooting deserved better. Those are the words Attorney General Merrick Garland used today to describe the handling of the school shooting that claimed the lives of 19 students and 2 staff members. Today, the Justice Department released a report on the attack, claiming massive missteps by law enforcement. The chief failure was that the authorities did not treat the crisis as an active shooter situation. Kimberly Rubio lost her daughter in the attack and says the report validates what they already knew.
We knew the failures that had happened. We just kind of, it makes more clarity now because it's written and now it's set in stone, and what we thought is true.
Rubio says she hopes the failures end today. The House committee that's seeking an impeachment of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas today brought in 2 mothers whose daughters were killed, one by murder, the other by fentanyl. We got more from Bloomberg's Irv Chapman.
Republican Michael McCall reacted to the testimony of Tammy Nobles, who spoke of her daughter's killer, a Salvadoran MS-13 gang member who was allowed into the United States.
She was killed 3 days after her 20th birthday, and I sent her a message on her birthday that I was proud of the woman that she was becoming.
Do you hold Mr. Mayorkas personally accountable for the death of your daughter?
Yes, I do.
I do too.
Josephine Dunn, whose daughter was poisoned by fentanyl, gave a similar response. In Washington, Irv Chapman, Bloomberg Radio.
President Biden says the U.S. will continue striking sites connected to Iran-backed Houthi militants in Yemen, even though the attacks have not slowed the Houthis' attacks on Red Sea shipping. Global news 24 hours a day, and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all advancing. Best level of the day right now for stocks, S&P up 33. That is a gain right now of just about 0.7%. Dow Industrials up 149. Best level there, higher now by about 0.4%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 180, higher now by 1.2%. A rally in some of the world's largest tech companies is fueling a rebound in stocks. Traders also weighing the latest economic signals and Fed speak for clues about the central bank's next steps. So we are seeing a move higher for the S&P after a back-to-back decline. S&P up 34, up 0.7. Again, we've got NASDAQ up by 1.2%. 10-year, 4.13%, with a 2-year right now, 4.35%. Gold up 13.50 the ounce, higher by 0.7%. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.5%, 79.05 on Brent. And to be clear, we've got West Texas Intermediate 73.98 a barrel. Bitcoin now at the lowest price level since the U.S. approved nearly a dozen ETFs last week that hold the cryptocurrency. Enthusiasm may be ebbing. Bitcoin down 3.1% right now, 41,313. Arkansas Republican Congressman French Hill was a guest moments ago right here on Sound On, and he discussed the regulatory framework for crypto.
Well, we had our what we call our fit for purpose for the 21st Century Act that set up the regulatory framework that directs the SEC and the CFTC precisely what to do in the regulation and oversight for digital assets. This is good for innovators, good for American companies, good for consumers and investors. We made all the changes that came out of our markup last July. We're now showing that to our colleagues on both sides of the aisle. And I think that bill is prepared to come to the floor when the Speaker and the Majority Leader are ready for it to be considered.
And you can hear more of the conversation on the Sound On podcast. Housing starts decline. Building permits picked up. A mixed day for a lot of the housing names. Case in point, Toll Brothers up 0.2%. KB Home up 1.4%. Pulte lower by 0.1%. Lennar up 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
I didn't even know they called it white label delivery. I guess that's like DoorDash and Uber Eats.
Yeah.
Shake Shack with the headline, raising white label delivery menu prices by 5%. Producer James puts that in front of us, not only because he's a big Shake Shack fan. He likes the burgers, and I can't blame him for that.
Great
You're a Shake
fries.
Shack fan.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Can't go wrong.
Walked by several of them in several airports on my way back here. I may have stopped at one of them. But we're going to be talking economy coming up here with Molly, and that's the kind of stuff. People talk about why Joe Biden isn't connecting with voters. That's a real story that someone's going to experience tonight that goes beyond the data.
Absolutely. Your price tag, when you look at a lot of things, is still higher. You look at your grocery receipt, probably a lot higher than it was pre-pandemic, pre-Biden administration, and therein lies the problem politically for Biden. The thing about it is the American consumer is still holding in there, still proving willing to pay these higher prices instead of demand going down. This is what the Fed wants, is demand to go down so that prices can stabilize and inflation can go lower. And the consumer has proved incredibly resilient. And a lot of that probably has to do with the labor market that's still really strong.
We're talking about jobs just this morning, as a matter of fact. And a conversation that I have been looking forward to. I wanted to bring Molly Smith into the conversation, Bloomberg economics editor, who you hear on Bloomberg Radio from time to time. We finally drafted her.
Yes, finally.
Bloomberg Sound On.
So happy
to
be
Molly,
here.
it's great to see you.
And I
well, it's
see
great
that you
to have
made
you
it
with
back
us.
to
Are you a
DC,
Shake Shack? I did, yes. I passed multiple Shake Shacks and even, well, gosh, of course, you know, the big chains here. But 5% is a lot of money. White Castle is where I really wanted to stop down, Molly. Are you a White Castle fan?
I've dabbled. Yeah, White Castle's a nice little burger. Sure.
You've had some late nights, then I understand. So, you know, we're having this whole debate about when the Fed might start cutting interest rates. And a lot of this, I'm assuming, is going to have to do with what Kaylee just mentioned, how long the consumer keeps on spending. What do you see?
I mean, retail sales data this week, if those are any indication, looks like there's still a lot more spending to be had. Wrapped up the year really well above forecasts, and the part of the retail sales report that's used to calculate GDP also came in very strong. So we'll get a better look at that next week when we get our first glimpse of the 4Q GDP estimate. But I mean, the data today, as you were alluding to as well, with jobless claims, it's trending really low. I mean, haven't seen it below 200,000 in quite some time. And this is these are really historically low levels of people who are initially applying for unemployment benefits. And even those people who are receiving continued benefits who've already been in the system was also trending lower in the latest week.
Yeah, 187,000 on initial claims, the lowest in September of 2022. We've seen jobs reports that have been stronger than expected as well, in addition to retail sales data and all of these other points you could look at, Molly. Doesn't really seem like an economy that needs a rate cut from the Federal Reserve, and yet the market is still betting those cuts are going to come, just maybe not as soon as March, right?
Yeah, and you know, that's an interesting point because like that's what a lot of people have been grappling with, right? Is that like it's not so much a matter of when with the rate cuts, but maybe also why is a good question to bring into it, and that this isn't a kind of rate cutting cycle that's going to be in response, is what most people are banking on at least, to some economic shock that, you know, like the pandemic, for example, when, you know, the Fed basically cut rates to zero, like right in the spring of 2020. This isn't going to be that kind of an interest rate cutting cycle. This is probably going to be gradual and slow and methodical, and that's how the Fed is planning to calculate these cuts, that this is more indicative of ideally the soft landing narrative that we've been seeing many signs of. So really just recalibrating rates to a normalized level that is no longer restrictive as they are now.
People should understand Molly Smith is not just some sort of broadcast personality. She's the person behind the terminal who writes these stories at 8:30 in the morning when the indicators hit, and has a pretty interesting perspective on that. Molly, what's the next data point that's going to matter to this conversation and potentially change this conversation?
I'd say, well, we've got like a couple of coming up. I mean, tomorrow probably would take a look at the University of Michigan inflation expectations numbers. Those have been coming down quite a lot. And the reason why the Fed cares about these is because inflation can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, if you are expecting higher prices, you maybe then will be less likely to push back on them, or maybe you will then ask for higher wages, which can then fuel higher prices again. So would not want to get into a kind of cycle like that. So good thing those have been coming down lately. So we'll get a measure of that tomorrow. Next week, the bigger ones are the GDP report, as I just said. So that'll be the government's first estimate of fourth quarter GDP. And the day after that, we get the Fed's preferred inflation measure, which is the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, PCE for short. And that one will also get us a look at inflation-adjusted consumer spending. And then, of course, the Fed meeting.
You know what else we got today? Yeah, the Fed meeting. That's the big one, Molly. The other data we got today is housing starts and building permits. And I have a particularly keen interest in the housing market, as I want to be first-time home buyer, still waiting for my entry point. What are we seeing in housing, Molly? Has it started to loosen up at all in the anticipation that mortgage rates are going to be lower?
Well, I wish you luck in that endeavor as a fellow millennial also trying to become a first-time home buyer. Yeah, it definitely, we have seen a lot more people come back into the market, and at least in terms of home buying applications for mortgages, that those have really come off of, you know, multi-decade lows since mortgage rates have now moved closer to around 7% versus 8%. So that's been a huge shift down in the mortgage rates there. And yeah, I mean, it's still going to take a bit of time for that to translate into more homes, right? You know, it takes a while to build a house. So builders are working through that, but at least they are feeling more confident. You know, we just had Charlie come in with the home builder stock. Some of those are up on the day. So I think you would start to see, I mean, they definitely, and at least with the permits number, seeing an indication of future demand that it looks like that's picking up as well.
The millennials' time to strike, Joe. Maybe
Yes,
it's almost
it's
here.
coming.
Molly and I are going to get a house.
We are trying.
Fresh
I mean,
off
I
her
did sign
tour
a
of
contract
Mexico
last
and
month.
the Caribbean.
Sorry, Joe?
Is that right?
Ooh.
No, I'm just telling everyone you were just fresh off your tour of Mexico while we were in.
Oh, yes. I was
She
at a
was in the
bachelorette
Caribbean.
party in Mexico. So I was being a very good consumer down there.
Really feel bad about that.
Wow, I wanna
I'm
be
so
Molly.
sorry.
All right, Molly, don't be a stranger. We're going to figure out a way for both of you guys to buy houses here on the program before this year is done. I'm convinced of that. Bloomberg economics editor with us live from New York. Don't be a stranger. With Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew, watching the mortgage rates. This is Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. The World Economic Forum underway in Davos. Bloomberg Radio is there. And this morning we caught up with Steve Schwartzman, the chairman and CEO of Blackstone Group, who spoke to us about the interest rate outlook.
I'm quite confident that they'll be lowering rates. Some people are like overly enthusiastic about when they do it. We don't really care when they do it. It's just the fact that we're going to go from a period of rising rates to a period of lowering rates.
And you can hear more of the conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. And, of course, on the Bloomberg, you can find complete Davos coverage under NI Davos. Spirit Airlines tumbling again today as investors take little solace from a pledge by the airline to strengthen its balance sheet in the wake of that failed takeover of the deep discount carrier by JetBlue. Now, the stock has sunk more than 70% since that ruling in Boston on January 16th, blocking JetBlue Airways' $3.8 billion purchase of Spirit. Right now, we do have Spirit shares trading lower by 14.1%. JetBlue higher now by 5.8%. The Japanese homebuilder Sekisui House has agreed to buy MDC Holdings in an all-cash transaction with an equity value of $4.9 billion. The transaction marks the latest move by the Japanese homebuilder to expand in the U.S. And those are our top company stories at this hour. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
As we keep you up to date now with world and national news, let's go next door and say hi to Nancy Lyons. She has world and national news from the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom here in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Hey, Joe. It's looking less likely that we will see a partial government shutdown this weekend. The Senate has approved a temporary funding measure known as a continuing resolution, or CR, that would extend government funding through early March. The House is also taking a vote this afternoon, but Congressman French Hill, a Republican, says he cannot say this will be the last CR.
People have squandered time so ineffectively over the past few months. We had the Speaker McCarthy effort to do this before the middle of November, before Thanksgiving, and instead of doing it, a small group of 8 people threw the Speaker out of his job.
Congressman French Hill told Bloomberg Sound On Republicans are most concerned about policy changes they can make in this spending package. The House Committee on Homeland Security has been holding a second impeachment hearing today against Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Republican lawmakers have been focused on the high levels of unauthorized migration across the southern border, while Democrats say the proceedings are a sham. Here's Republican House Homeland Security Chairman Mark Green.
Because of Secretary Mayorkas' border crisis, American cities and neighborhoods are less safe. Secretary Mayorkas' refusal to enforce the law, which requires him to detain and remove illegal aliens, has tragically increased crime and endangered public safety across the country.
Green's words concerning Mayorkas are being disputed by the White House that calls the push to impeach the Homeland Security Secretary unconstitutional. Bloomberg has obtained a document that says House Republicans plan to advance an impeachment resolution against Mayorkas on January 31st. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is rejecting U.S. calls to scale back Israel's military offensive in the Gaza Strip or to take steps toward creating a Palestinian state after the war. An administration official says, obviously, they see things differently. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg. Now back to you, Joe and Kaylee.
All right, Nancy, I appreciate it. How do you think Richie Neal feels and the rest of the gang, Jason Smith, at the Ways and Means Committee? And I ask you that. You interviewed Jason Smith yesterday. I did. Everyone's leaving town. The big news during the show, breaking during Sound On today, is that the Senate passed the stopgap. It's going to the House.
And they're going to try to...
tells us they're going to get it done, right?
Yep, pass it to, get out of here before the snow. That's the idea.
So snowstorm, going to have 4 or 5 inches here tomorrow, whatever. Everyone's going to be gone by then, unless you work for the Ways and Means Committee, which has a 9 a.m. markup scheduled on this tax deal. That will be the height of the storm.
Yeah.
Do you think they're really doing this?
They're probably trying to bump it up, I would imagine.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Maybe they'll have that hearing today or markup today. So Jason Smith on Balance of Power last evening was reassuring that this is going to get done or not? Because he was walking a fine line,
He said he's not trying to rush this because, of course, tax season is coming up on January 29th.
Yeah.
He did not commit to trying to get this across the finish line by then, hopefully in the next few weeks. Interestingly, he did also say that Speaker Johnson has not formally endorsed this bill, which I found interesting. The other thing, though, is it's not just Speaker Johnson's opinion that matters. There's a lot of opinions out there about what should be done in terms of tax policy. And he said, you know, as soon as the deal's released, everyone comes in, wants changes. Changes are going to be what kills the bill. So I asked him specifically about the SALT cap, which I know everyone listening in New York,
Alarms are going off.
and Tim Stenovic probably care about this.
Wait,
doesn't
did you
seem like
say
the SALT
something?
cap's going to make it into this one.
Yeah. We're talking salt, Carol. We're not, I mean, you know, this lands right in your lap, right?
Nothing drives us crazy more than that, to be quite honest.
She's right.
It's not right. It's not fair.
Okay, as opposed to, it's funny because we also drive people crazy in states where this doesn't apply. We're like, what are you talking about with this? But It just won't go away, Kaylee.
Yeah.
I don't know that that'll change in this term.
I don't
But guys, it looks like we're not going to shut down the government. I have that for you in New York.
Hey, that's some good news.
Yes.
Yeah.
We can do some things.
Until March,
especially when
right?
there's
So
snow
they can
coming.
get something done.
Yeah. Yes, just keep
We're
the
leaving
winter
you.
weather coming, I guess is the secret. You know what that means. Kaylee and I are out of here. We'll meet you at Balance of Power, Kaylee Lines. Bloomberg Business Week starts right now.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. Live from the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, streaming on YouTube and, of course, on Bloomberg Originals, our streaming service. It is Friday's Eve.
Yeah, Thursday, January 18th. I saw Doug Krisner a little earlier. It's Asia Friday for him.
It is Asia. It ain't our Friday yet.
It's not our Friday yet, but we're getting there. That's
are.
Carol Masser. I'm Tim Stenevec, and happy Thursday, Carol.
Some enthusiasm, too. I won't call it exuberance, but after 2 days of declines, we are seeing stocks higher in the Thursday session. They're kind of hovering around their highs of the day, but really bounced back in the last hour or so. Even as U.S. yields pushed higher, tech stocks, folks, that's where you see the outperformance.
Bulls are saying, thank you, Apple. Thank you, TSMC. That's kind of a little preview
Getting
of
at
a
those
couple
little
of the
thank you
gainers
white
that
note
you
cards.
have.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, they're excited.
They are. On that, we're going to talk about that Apple upgrade. Yes, you heard right. It was an actual upgrade. We've had a few downgrades already this year on the name, but definitely a different tone there. And also semi-surging as Taiwan Semiconductor's outlook spurred hopes for a global tech recovery this year. So all of a sudden, you know, we're kind of high on the tech sector.
Hey, speaking of the tech sector, we're going to check in with one top-performing fund manager on why he's actually underweight the Magnificent Seven. On the call, our own Paul Brennan said this, and you said, wait, what?
In the next few hours, he has started 5 companies. He's spun out some. He started a new investment vehicle last year. He's also got a new book. He's a busy dude. The book is entitled How to Make a Few Billion Dollars. Brad Jacobs, founder and chairman at the freight services provider XPO. He's going to be here in our studio.
Also, a check on who some say is or has been calling the shots on Republicans in Washington. The world knows him well. And in the 4 o'clock hour, Carol, Elon Musk's SpaceX is set to launch the first all-European commercial crew to the International Space Station. We're going to have that live.
I always love watching that. And then we're also going to take you inside the first U.S. production facility for making something super chewy. We're talking about gummy bears.
Hey, that's a sweet assignment.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Dun, dun, dun. Clue.
Your silence speaks volumes.
Cue the crickets.
Okay.
See, I'm already in Friday mode. Yeah, it's a really cool story. It's on the Bloomberg. It's really fun to read
Incredible pictures, too.
Who doesn't love a gummy bear? And Matt Miller, if you're listening, I'm not talking about those kind of gummies.
They're not doing those, Matt.
They are not. Got to talk about the markets. A rally underway on Wall Street, especially the tech names. Time to count down to the close. Start now.
Countdown to the close. Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage ahead of the U.S. market close starts right now.
This is the countdown to the close. Romaine Bostic alongside Scarlett Fu. We're joined right now by our colleagues Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec. Welcome to our audiences across all of our Bloomberg platforms, television, radio originals, our partnership with those folks streaming on YouTube, and well, no halo behind Tim, but a relatively bright day right now in U.S. equity markets.
Not yet, yeah.
Yeah, definitely, right? The bull's in charge, it feels like, and it really feels like in the last 60 minutes or so, we really got to move to the upside. Having said that, jams, jellies, and gummies are on our mind on this Thursday.
Okay, I don't know where this is going.
Slow your roll when it comes to gummies, everybody. First up, we're going to talk about J.M. Smucker. This story, actually, Tim, it came on his radar. Our own team, Joe Constance, reporting. She got like 5 minutes. She does this series. But talked with the head, the CEO of Smucker, Mark Smucker. He's, I think, 5th generation of the family to run the company.
Is he related to the original?
I think it's, I think his parents just knew that he was destined to take this job. Okay. So that's how it worked out.
Smucker. Yeah. All right, anyway, he's talking about core weeks for his employees. So basically, you can be in the office every other week doing like a Tuesday to Thursday.
Really?
Yeah, this is pretty cool.
Pretty cool, right?
And it's
Working
actually
in the office 3 days out of 10 days.
Yeah.
That's right. And you work remotely on Mondays and Fridays, and then the non-core
I'm
weeks.
stunned.
You can actually live anywhere in the country you want. It's on your dime to get to the corporate offices, which are just outside of Cleveland, Ohio. But you'd only have to do that a couple times a month.
Okay.
And he says it's working out really well. He says it's working really well
Been
for
a success, right?
retention and attracting employees.
And other companies are contacting him.
That's what I thought
to
was
hear
really
more.
interesting. Yeah, he said, look, there's a difference between what we do and, you know, what the big banks are doing. And he mentioned Jamie Dimon and David Solomon and their return to work. He said, you know, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but it's working for us.
Do you want to put it in the suggestion box?
Well, I don't know. Maybe I'll use this as an opportunity to announce my departure from Bloomberg News. I'll be joining J.M. Smucker as the new host of their Jam and Jelly countdown segment.
Well, let's
every
talk
day.
about gummies too, because that's
Right
a
up
perfect
against your
segue.
show.
I know
3 to 5.
Romain is a big fan of gummy candy because I've seen him eat it during breaks.
Does he really?
Yes, totally. He snuck a couple in. Bloomberg visited Haribo's.
Didn't I know
That's
that?
the secret.
Wow, learning something new.
Yes.
I don't. Scarlett's lying.
No,
She
not.
never lies.
Bloomberg visited Haribo's first production plant in Wisconsin to make their gold bears, their gummy bears. The video is fascinating, but this is also my favorite candy, so I loved
This is a hard day for me because first I learned that J.M. Smucker has this great policy, and now I learned that we sent one of our reporters out to the Haribo
And it wasn't
factory,
you.
and it wasn't me here. What am I here for? Don't answer that, girl.
What I learned in this is that the flavors, we know that they always have different colored gummy bears, but the flavors are raspberry red, lemon yellow, orange, pineapple white, and strawberry green. The green is strawberry, guys.
Yeah, this is great. So I as soon as I saw this story, I sent because it has nice animation in it. I sent it to my son to see how these things. I never really knew how these things were made. I guess it kind of makes sense. They would have a mold and everything else. But there's a whole debate now in our household as to whether the flavors are really different or whether this is like what was it, Fruit Loops, where we all found out that all the different colors are the same flavor.
We're speaking to Dina Shanker a little bit later in the program. That's a question I'm going to ask her. I'm also going to ask how many, gummy bears died in the production of this story. Because
they make 60 million every day.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
No chip.
There's also regional
no semiconductor.
Regional differences with what people like in different parts of the world. So
Wait,
turns
regional
out,
differences in gummy bears or candy? Or gummy candy?
in types of the gummies, so not gummy bears necessarily, but here in America we're not huge fans of licorice apparently.
Can I tell you, Tim spent a lot of time reading this one today.
Yeah.
I got into it.
But it's good. And if you ever
It is
go,
good.
like there's a couple stores that we were talking a little bit earlier. There's a great place in Washington, D.C. that has basically all the flavors that they make. And you get all those crazy ones from different parts of the world that they don't normally sell here. So you get a sense here.
They're
of,
true German
different
gummy,
tastes.
right?
Yeah, but a lot of them like have less sugar and other things like that. So you're like, give me
Wait,
the
they loaded
good
them up with
old-fashioned.
sugar to
Do you guys know why it's called Haribo?
No.
It's a portmanteau of the founder's name and then the town where it was founded, Bonn, Germany. Yeah.
That's good to know.
There you go.
It's the only gummy bear brand I'll eat.
Are you done?
I'm done.
Okay.
I'm just going
Carol,
to
are you
say,
done?
we have like a million guests on the show, and this one, I think you spent
Yeah, I spent most of my day
most of the day
thinking about
reading
it.
this one and planning for it. With good reason. It's a
Again,
great
more
read.
behind the scenes that people don't need to know about.
Right.
All right, good stuff, guys. We're going to be back in less than an hour's time. Wrap up the Thursday trading day. Join us on radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals, our cross-platform. We call it Beyond the Bell. We'll see you at 4 p.m. Wall Street. Shelf gummies for a moment, but we will have more in the 5 o'clock hour because it is a killer story. Only the way Bloomberg Business Week and Bloomberg can do it. It's really cool. So stick around for that a little bit later on. In the meantime, wait, do you have more?
I got nothing.
Okay.
I want to save some for Dina Shanker, too. Normally she covers fake meat. So this is a nice little break for her.
I'm more a Swedish fish kind of gal. All right, so some economic news today. Initial applications for U.S. unemployment benefits unexpectedly dropped last week, lowest level in more than a year. So we're showing once again some signs of resilience once again in the labor market to kick off this new year. Then we got construction of new homes in the U.S. falling for the first time in 4 months. That was in December, dragged down by a drop in single-family homes, home building, I should say.
Okay.
Yeah.
The message seems to be go slowly. That from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta President Raphael Bostic, who urged policymakers to proceed cautiously toward interest rate cuts, given the potential economic impact of unpredictable events ranging from elections at home to conflicts around the world. By the way, Mr. Bostic is a voting member on the monetary policy when it comes to monetary policy this year, and he wants to see more evidence that inflation is on track to reach the Fed's 2% target. Carol, he's not expecting a Fed rate cut until the third quarter of the year.
Yeah, so later on in 2024. All right, so that's your economic, your Fed kind of chatter backdrop. There's more Fed speak, though, to get to. Let's get to it, though, with our roundtable. Bloomberg Economics U.S. economist Stuart Paul here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. And then we've also got Bloomberg News Fed team leader Kate Davidson. She's out there in our Washington, D.C. bureau. Hello to both of you. Stuart, let's kick it off with you. The data drop first. Anything of note today?
Sure. So as you mentioned, Carol, initial unemployment claims continue dropping, surprisingly so, reaching levels unseen since September of 2022.
Anything seasonal here that we should know?
So there were seasonal firing in the previous week.
Okay.
But the fact that initial unemployment claims on a seasonally adjusted basis dropped, it's in large part because of employee retention. Right? So the seasonal firing that you would typically expect, the after-holiday layoffs, just did not occur, at least in this week. Continuing claims continue dropping as well, suggesting that the unemployment rate's going to remain subdued. Tim, the thing that I'd bring up on the housing side is that, yes, starts dropped for the first time in a long time, but part of that was just a give back from a monster November. November housing starts increased something like 10.8%, so there was about a 4% decline in December. So if you're looking at those 2 months and you're smoothing over time, it's still really gangbusters. And a big part of that story is just the unseasonably warm weather, right? So unseasonably warm weather supports housing starts.
Makes
Something
sense.
like the 61 days between November and December, only 10 days had temperatures on average below the 30-year normal.
That makes
I mean,
sense.
Pretty astonishing.
It's amazing.
Right?
There's always a weather element here when we're talking about this, whether it's
it
the
matters.
summer or the winter. Hey, Kate, come on in here because we got we heard from a lot of Fed speakers in the last few days, and the message seems to be pretty consistent that we're going to wait until it's time to cut rates. When we cut rates, what's the narrative that you're picking up on? And to me, it doesn't seem like the market is necessarily, I don't know, not necessarily understanding that narrative. What are you hearing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that's been a consistent theme, even over, say, the past year, is that there's this dissonance, right, between what Fed officials are saying and what markets expect, because I think that's reflecting, in some ways, just different expectations for the economy. And so I think that markets are picking up on, obviously, this really strong run of inflation data, a lot of progress that we've seen, and Fed officials aren't denying that. They're really excited about it. They say it's great. They're very happy with the progress. They just want to see more of it. And so I think markets are saying, like, hey, what are we waiting for here? You're seeing all the things you want to see. Those 6-month numbers of inflation over the past 6 months are almost at your target. And I think that Raphael Bostic in particular, who spoke this morning, the Atlanta Fed president, he kind of summed it up with just we definitely don't want to start cutting and then be forced to raise again. I mean, that is still a big worry for some of them.
That would be a bummer of a mistake, no doubt about it. Having said that, Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia President Patrick Harker, as we said, there's a bunch of Fed speak, also weighing in, and he talked about soft data that will keep guiding policymakers. He said they help not only better explain what I may be seeing in the economic updates, but can also give me insights of emerging issues that may not show up in the numbers until further down the road. So whether it's, private company data and so on and so forth, that it sounds like, he is maybe seeing stuff already, Kate, and that is making him feel like, maybe the Fed is more likely to cut sooner rather than later. But how do you read it?
Sure. Well, I think we have heard Pat Harker and Raphael Bostic, also Tom Barkin, others have started saying this last year, that what they were hearing from their business contacts on the ground was seemed to be a little bit ahead of what we were seeing in the data. Obviously, hard government data. If we're talking about soft data versus hard data, like the Harker essay was today, the hard data is backward looking, right? It's very good. It's more reliable, but it might not be giving you kind of current conditions, which are changing fast. And so we actually had a nice story, our Fed team, late last year about this phenomenon that officials seem to be leaning into this idea of relying more on the anecdotal evidence to support this kind of surprising, it seems sort of sudden, the pivot that we heard and saw in December. Just this idea that we feel like we're in a good place right now. We don't need to keep raising rates.
Well, and to me, it feels like anecdotal can be, like we do it with just guests who come in the studio, that it feels like it can be much, much more timely of like what's happening in this moment. So Stuart, when you think about that, the soft data, how do you roll that into you and the team and how you think about where rates are going, how the U.S. economy is going this year?
Yeah, so our general framework is that the anecdotes come first, then the soft data start reflecting the anecdotes, and then the hard data start reflecting the soft data and the anecdotes. So yeah, when you start looking at the anecdata, you start hearing more about job losses, you start hearing more about firms that are slowing their wage growth, that are taking down job postings. They'll post and ghost, right? They'll see applicants and then just ignore them.
Yeah.
And so we're anticipating a slowdown in the labor market, and we're also starting to see, this is where the data are, you could call them softer data. They're not our typical headline data prints, but you see credit card balances increasing. You start seeing defaults on the rise for both credit cards and for other
Fed
consumer
survey
loans
just
like
this week,
autos.
right?
Exactly. And so when that's the case, you have to start anticipating that consumers are going to be tightening their belts. You can't wait around to see the 4Q GDP data next week to start making policy decisions. So we are among those who are expecting the Fed to begin cutting rates in March and then to proceed relatively slowly thereafter.
So
that's right.
You guys still hold to that?
Yeah, so give us the reasons you're sticking to that, because as of this week, I mean, Friday, traders were essentially betting via swaps that it was an 80% chance that we'd see a March rate cut. Now, as of yesterday, it was down to about 50%.
Right.
So why are you sticking with it?
So we just don't find some of the retail sales data as compelling as those who pared back their bets on rate cuts, right? As you said, odds went from about 80% based on market-based expectations to about 50%. But if you continue looking at things under the surface of the labor market, if you look at the duration of unemployment, you look at typical average hours worked, so the amount of labor that's actually being expended into the economy and the amount that employers want to keep workers at their desks producing output, they're all far softer than the headline figures suggest. And then we bake in the fact that we know payrolls are going to get revised down based on the quarterly Census of Employment and Wages data that we saw several months ago.
Right.
When we know that the re-benchmarking of payrolls takes place, the labor market's going to look weaker, and if folks just aren't looking at those data points, they're going to be missing that.
No, it's a really good point. Hey, Kate, come on back in. Got about a minute left here. Right, next week is the dark out period, right, for the Fed. We will not hear from Fed speakers, and then we're gonna, we're counting down to that January 31 Fed announcement. We don't expect any kind of rate move. Could we get something on the balance sheet, on the quantitative moves that we've seen by the Fed over the last couple of years? What is it that's top of mind for you on that January 31st meeting?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that the big question, of course, is any sort of signal that Chair Powell sends about what they're likely to do in March. I mean, I think it would be surprising if he totally took March off the table. They want to keep their options open. As you mentioned, the Fed funds futures are around 50%, the odds of a March cut, which I think that they're probably pretty happy with. They like to have the option, right, to go either way.
It's a coin toss. It's a coin toss.
Right, right. I think he's not going to give, I think, a strong hint either way. But of course, we'll be listening for that. People definitely will ask about the balance sheet. I imagine that discussion is probably going to pick up at this meeting. We might not get a lot of hints on it, but I'm sure that the chairman will be asked about it.
Stuart, 20 seconds, really quickly. Next key economic point, is it next Friday, PCE?
Well, we're going to get GDP on Thursday, then a bit more detail in what sort of spending consumers are doing. We're going to get that on Friday. Probably most important is PCE inflation. We're expecting 0.15% month-over-month core PCE inflation.
Something the Fed watches, we know.
Exactly.
All right, guys, thank you so much. Bloomberg Economics U.S. economist Stuart Paul, and of course, Bloomberg News Fed team leader Kate Davidson. Guys, thank you so much.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 3:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, and the Russell 2000 all advancing. Best level of the day right now on the Dow. Dow Industrials up 189, higher by about 0.5%. Reversing earlier losses, S&P up 38, up 0.8%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 193, up by 1.3%. 10-year at 4.13%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.35%. Spot gold up 0.7%. 20.20 the ounce for spot gold, while West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.9%, 73.96 a barrel. Enthusiasm for Bitcoin waning today. Bitcoin down now by 4%, 40,951 on Bitcoin. A rally in some of the world's largest tech companies is fueling today's rebound, with traders also weighing the latest economic data and Fed speak for clues about the central bank's next steps. So what about recalibrating those rate cut expectations? That question this morning for Seema Shah, Chief Global Strategist at Principal Global Investors.
In terms of how the market is pricing rate cuts for this year, it is too soon. Too soon. March is very, very premature to think about rate cuts. At the same time, and probably more important in terms of the timing of that first cut, is how many cuts. Now, we would say that 6 to 7 rate cuts only happens if you've got a deeply negative economic backdrop, which we're not anticipating.
And you can hear more of the conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcast. Spirit Airlines tumbling again today as investors take little solace from a pledge by the airline to strengthen its balance sheet in the wake of a failed takeover by JetBlue of the deep discount carrier. Right now, we do have shares of Spirit. They are down another 7.5% today. JetBlue shares up by 6.3%. Briefly, J.B. Hunt, the transportation company, boosting its dividend to 43 cents a share from 42 cents. J.B. Hunt shares are trading higher, up now by just about 3.1%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much, Charlie Pellet. Well, the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index, the SOX, turned positive for the year today, rallying thanks to an upbeat outlook from the behemoth, TSMC, Taiwan's semiconductor, which is the main chip maker to Apple and NVIDIA. Tim, the space overall up 3.3%.
And TSMC's CEO saying the company expects a return to solid growth this quarter and gave itself room to raise capital spending this year, suggesting the world's most valuable chip maker anticipates a recovery in smartphone and computing demand. So we got a lot going on in the chip space this week, and fortunately,
TSMC, by the way, up 9% right now.
Wow.
The ADRs
Look at
in here
that.
in the U.S.
Okay.
Yeah.
So with the macro, with the micro, let's bring in our chip king, otherwise known as Ian King,
Sorry.
Bloomberg News U.S. semiconductor and networking reporter.
We had to,
I'm
Ian.
sorry, and we do that all the time, but you really are
You
the chip
are.
king. You know it all. So news from TSMC lifting the whole space. Is this because essentially investors and analysts are looking to TSMC's results and saying, okay, this is a positive outlook. Now we're bullish on tech because TSMC provides so much of the parts to these huge tech companies?
No, that's 100% the reason. If there was one company that had the ability to look through the window into what every other company in so many levels of the tech economy were doing, it would be TSMC. They supply the chip makers, the giants like NVIDIA. They supply the device makers like Apple. They supply the cloud companies, like Amazon with all of the chips that run everything. So 100% yes, this is, if there was one company that was going to tell you, hey, all boats are floating, it would be TSMC.
It's like, yay, pop the champagne corks. Having said that, what we love about you is you have this great perspective on chip cycles. And I do wonder, right? You've explained it to us, right? Demand amps up, and then there's not enough supply, and then chip companies spend money to raise demand or raise the supply, and then there leads to oversupply, and then there's weakness. So does it all apply even today, even though every day I feel like Ian, Tim and I come on and we remind everybody that there are chips in just about everything except gummy bears, which we just talked about on air. But you know what I mean? Is there something different about the cycle, or it still applies? And if so, where are we in this chip cycle?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's always a good question, and that's particularly the case this time around. I mean, roll this back 2 years ago, and the chip industry executives were saying, this time it's different. We're on a path up and to the right. And then you look at last year, and that really wasn't the case. Again, we were down again because of that cycle that you just described. What is different, though, this time is how some of the end markets are behaving. If you're making AI accelerators like NVIDIA is, you're printing money. There couldn't be more demand. If you're making smartphone processors, that's not a great market. We're probably through the worst of this inventory decline, but it's not like every consumer in the world has gone out, thrown their iPhone away and bought a new one. Same is true with the PCs. So with regards to the end markets, I think, that there is something different here in terms of where we are in the cycle. It's perhaps being driven by other things this time.
Well, what exactly is it being driven by? Anything other than AI?
Up until recently, we had been driven by optimism about electric vehicles, about self-driving vehicles, about the automation of industry in all of its forms. But unfortunately, at least for the chip makers, that has kind of tailed off as a driver, as something to get excited about. And really probably what TSMC is showing is like, look, we're not as burdened by the PC and the smartphone downturn now. So the upside that we're seeing that had already been strong is having a greater impact on our revenues, right? There's the things that are pulling us down are less than the things that are making us buoyant, and the things that are making us buoyant is really this AI build out that we're seeing in the data centers of the world.
Well, on that, and we just have a chart that we want to kind of share with our audience. You can watch us on YouTube and Bloomberg Originals. But as to TMC, they are projecting a reversal of that decline that they saw last year, and they talk about AI driving tech demand. So the CEO at TSMC saying revenue should grow in the low to mid 20% range this year, reversing the slight decline of 2023. We have a chart up there. 2022 was gangbusters. 2020 wasn't bad either. It seems like
25% in 2020.
Yeah, and then 2024 compared to last year, it's pretty dramatic on the chart here. Is TSMC like the one to watch in terms of figuring out where we are in the cycle, though, for you?
I believe so. I mean, what we have to be aware of here is revenue is a function as well of pricing.
Ah, smart.
And if
which explains 2020, right? Probably.
Right. Yeah. And you're talking here, if there's a greater emphasis on AI chips, I mean, go and try buy an NVIDIA accelerator right now. It's arguable that these things cost maybe $2,000 to make, which is very expensive for a chip, but they're selling them for $50,000, right? So.
Wow.
And they normally go for what?
Well, again, it depends, right? NVIDIA will never tell us, but if you look on the reseller sites where you can't actually get them anymore, these things have gone from sort of 10 grand for an add-in card, which is basically one chip, and now we're looking at, the price of a family car or a mid-range car.
That's amazing.
That is, it's like it's really the internals of this business, and it's really fascinating, Ian. It's why we love to kind of pick your brain about it.
Hey, speaking of picking your brain, Ian, wanted to get your thoughts. We haven't had a chance to speak with you about Synapsys and Ansys and the big deal that we covered earlier this week. I have to confess, and our listeners know this, our viewers know this, Carol knows this.
I'm guilty too.
This it's a huge deal. But those names not really on our radar the same way that some of the other companies that we cover are certainly on our radar day in and day out. What were your reactions and what are the implications of this deal?
Why should we care too? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we should care because the buyer is one of two companies along with Cadence that own a market that is increasingly important. That's the market for software that allows people to design semiconductors and electronic components. As more and more companies are moving into that, we've seen Amazon, Microsoft, you name it, moving into that area. This market is growing. What this purchase does is take the technology into another dimension and add another bow, because when you're, for example, designing an aircraft or something like that, you're increasingly making that vehicle, that plane, or that data center into a holistic piece of electronics. The electronics that goes into it isn't just something you stick in there and becomes a part of it. It's whole. So how that electronics determines the design of the whole device, how that electronics interacts with other physical things that go into the design of that particular giant device, if you like, really matters. So this is a vertical play here, a kind of a vertical stacking play, and in theory gives the purchaser a real advantage there in something which is which a lot of people are saying is growing.
It's so interesting. I know it's going to take, it looks like a while because there's regulatory concerns. I guess China can also weigh in. So really interesting. Based on the chip flow, it's early in January. It's early in 2024. 30 seconds, Ian. And obviously TSMC looks like an upbeat year for the space. Just quickly.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are projecting that, but we're going to get a lot of earnings over the next couple of weeks, and some of the companies and some of the sectors that they're in, not so great, and it's going to be a case of like, how low can we go before we bounce back?
You are the chip king. I'm sorry that we did that, but you are. Ian, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Some really smart insight as always. Our own Ian King, Bloomberg News U.S. semiconductor and networking reporter Ian King, joining us on Zoom from San Francisco. So, yeah, just puts it all together.
Love it.
Yeah.
He really is the chip king.
I know.
It's fair to call him that.
I hope he doesn't.
I hope he doesn't mind. He still comes back and hangs out with us.
Please
so.
always come back.
Yeah,
please always come back. But smart perspective. We talk about context of what we do here, and he really puts it in context.
Well, speaking of context, let's get a check-in on the latest world and national news. We've got Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Nance.
Hey, Tim. Well, the House this afternoon is taking up a continuing resolution, or CR, to keep the government funded through early March and avoid a partial shutdown this weekend. The Senate passed the CR earlier this afternoon.
On this vote, the yeas are 77, the nays are 18. The 60-vote threshold having been achieved, the bill is passed.
The interim measure would fund some U.S. agencies through March 1st and others through March 8th. Lawmakers until the next deadline will continue working on annual funding for the fiscal year that began October 1st. A long-awaited report is out from the Justice Department on the police response to the deadly school shooting in Uvalde, Texas. And it doesn't pull any punches, as we hear from Bloomberg's Nathan Hager in Washington.
Cascading failures and no urgency. Those are just some of the words the Justice Department uses about police in its 600-page report on what happened at Robb Elementary School. It says a lack of communication and leadership and inadequate training and technology kept the crisis going far longer than it should have, even as trapped students and terrified parents pleaded with police to go in. 19 students and 2 teachers were killed at Robb on May 24th, 2022. Attorney General Merrick Garland says the victims and survivors deserved better. In Washington, I'm Nathan Hager, Bloomberg Radio.
A House panel is expected to vote on an impeachment resolution of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas January 31st. The House Homeland Security Committee is holding its final Mayorkas impeachment hearing today. Republicans say Mayorkas has failed at his job, while the ranking Democrat on the Homeland Security Committee, Benny Thompson, calls this a MAGA spectacle. Mayorkas was unavailable to testify before the committee today. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.